What's up, guys? I got something important to share with you today, and it has to do with bringing jobs back into your country. And it's important that you spread this information to your friends and family. But also, you gotta be doing your own research and information gathering. And on that note, I want you to subscribe to a channel called Johnny Gat. The guy's got some good information. And also check out Merle Barrel 1, also Vigilant Citizen. But still be sure to question everything that you hear, just in general. And also, I want to say that I have no hatred for those who haven't done me wrong. So I don't hate the Jews, only those that have done me harm. It makes no sense to hate the Jews in general, because first of all, no one's been able to really identify where they really originate from. Even then, it makes no sense to attack people who've done you no harm, rather than concentrating on the system that's built to oppress you. After all, Jew or not, everyone has a price. And instead of having us investigate this issue as a collective, they would much rather have us killing each other in a war. Another thing is that the word Jew has now become synonymous with Mafia, so there's no point in thinking about them in terms of race. After all, it's all about divide and conquer, and it goes like this. First, they want war with Muslims, and if they can't get that, they want war with China. And if they can't get that, they'll take war with Jews, as long as they get their war. You see, this is what was wrong with Hitler's ideology. I mean, really, for centuries, the Mafia has proven that they're willing to kill children, women, and men who have done them no harm, including Jews. Jews should know this very well, and that if current trends continue and these people end up with absolute power, it's over for them as well, because they'll no longer have anyone else to mess with. Now, you might have noticed that there's a lot of fake pro-white YouTube channels now that promote whites but hate on Jews. This is to prepare their last option, which is to spark a war with Jews. And all these white nationalist shield channels have the goal of preventing different ethnicities from befriending each other. It's to prevent the truth from spreading internationally, which would cause the Mafia's downfall. And that's what this video is about. And let me tell you, it's not the best way to win, it's the only way. And a lot of these shield channels are giving out bad advice, such as getting you to focus on the idea of overthrowing your country's government, totally overlooking the fact that they control all governments and every military. So what'll happen, and what has happened, is they'll cause a false flag in another country to justify taking you down. This system, and thus their ability to fund militaries, will only go down when the truth spreads worldwide. It's important to remember also that politicians use the fear of outsiders to maintain their power. Now, with the way things stand, there's a distinct possibility that they're up to something similar to what happened in Russia, with the camps and starvation. I'll be talking about that further into the video. But for now, let's talk about the Chinese, who, by the way, right now are the most important to wake up.
And I'm just off to China.
Now, you see this comment? I've done nothing to lead people to believe that I'm Chinese. You see, this is just a forced meme by 4chan Jews. You can see this kind of thing all over Poll, and about a third of my subscribers are from 4chan. The reason this meme is forced is because it's not based in reality. It's just a way to associate everything negative with the Chinese.
Like when I get an anti-Semitic post lobbed at me with like a big old nose and like a "hey Jew, oy vey, shut him down," like wouldn't bother me less. You know what I mean? Like, because I just know that it's probably like an Asian kid.
My mother was born in Berlin in 1937 to, a pretty Jewish clan.
Now, when I put this information out, there are two responses. Let me get your thoughts on these. Number one, I'm the tall Chinese guy. People will say below, they say, I am an atheist, but I am a conservative, I'm a libertarian.
I am Jewish. Emily, lying about all sorts of stuff, all because I said that my wife's grandfather was Jewish. And I said that because I'm not ashamed of that. It was like a Jewish doctor. Now, my wife's a Christian. Her dad, Christian family. The whole point is that it doesn't matter. So I've said, I'm Jewish. Fine. I'm Jewish then. My whole issue is that news saying censor us, and our lapdog media going, thank God the Chinese, you mean communist Chinese murderers, are here. Not the biggest censors in the world are now running our censorship. Red alert, oh my God.
But I have another part to this video that's just for Jews. It's sort of long, so everyone else can stop watching now because this is probably boring Jewish stuff. It's even a little bit boring to me, and I'm Jewish myself. Simply be dead prisoners murdered by the Chinese government, in some cases, to harvest their organs for the billion-dollar international organ trade.
You see, they're just trying to create conflict, but the truth is, they've already infiltrated China. Now pay attention to this next clip. It's of Michael Chan Wyman, a triad-turned-actor in Hong Kong.
黑社會呢兩個字係只有香港政府講嘅啫，全世界冇講黑社會嘅，係講幫會。我哋中國好多孫中山幫會。
Sun Yat-sen was the first president and founding father of the Republic of China. He was also apparently a gangster, but not gangster enough to keep himself from being cucked by Morris Cohen, who happened to be aide-de-camp to Sun Yat-sen and apparently bragged about the guy's wife. Now, when Morris was younger, he was educated in the Hayes Industrial School for wayward Jewish boys. But anyways, Sun Yat-sen and Morris Cohen were really close.
To pay tribute for his historic contribution to national independence, social progress.
The first president was also supported by the Black Dragon Society, a Japanese ultranationalist group that believed in Pan-Asianism. He even grabbed himself a 15-year-old Japanese waifu. Now before him, China was led by Pu Yi, the last emperor of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. Later, he also became the emperor of the Japanese puppet state Manchuria, marrying a Manchurian Jap who had changed her surname to sound Han Chinese. You see, the thing is, a lot of officials in the Qing dynasty really liked that there Jewish back pain medicine, and they would do anything they were told to because of it. This goes back to importers of mostly Indian-grown opium, such as David Sassoon, a Baghdadi Jew who was the leader of the Jewish community in present-day Mumbai. Because of their trade in opium and cotton, the Sassoon family became extremely wealthy and eventually spread into China itself.
I think that the Hong Kong Jewish story really starts with the Sassoon family, and this is from about the 1840s. And they were really the founders of the community. They built the synagogue.
They had a great sense of humor. Also, the nationalists that overthrew the Qing were funded in part by the sale of the drug. But still, Pu Yi was close to the likes of Mao, who was also friends with plenty of Jews. He even offered Henry Kissinger 10 million Chinese women, but got turned down. Like, what is he, gay? But anyways, these days there's still several foreigners of the chosen variety in the Chinese government. The fact is, they already have China under their thumb, and as long as they do, they feel invincible. But they are afraid of the Chinese people waking up one day. That's why the country is so heavily censored.
He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
You see, for the longest time, they felt invincible using America as their hammer to silence dissidents, but now it's China's turn. So now, to prevent that from happening and avoid another World War situation, the Chinese need to know about them. Right now, lots of juice elites are teaching their kids Mandarin to prepare to move over. And in recent years, gun laws have started to tighten up in America. Those laws were only so lax in the first place so that they could protect themselves, but now they don't plan on staying. Meanwhile, they're using their tried and true tricks to ferment hate in preparation for a future conflict. So when they do make the move to China, that doesn't mean that people are safe, far from it. It just means they have a new hammer, and it's no longer you, Burgerland. But yeah, if they then start killing people without any provocation like in the Middle East, they lose all legitimacy right away. But either way, they're still in the process of killing people by strangling the economy. The idea that China has taken all the jobs is nonsense when you consider that all big companies are owned by just a handful of people. They don't even need to give you jobs since they also control the money. They also don't need to sell anything useful to the public and instead just scan them out of their wealth. It's the system itself that's deliberately killing jobs in order to crush people financially. This is how this stuff really works, but to truly understand economics, you need to research a little bit on Andrew Jackson and how he fought the bank and their unbacked currency. The bank is one of their biggest methods of control, but one thing that can be done is to use automation to create automated public banking. If the software is open source, they lose their ability to use banking to scam people. But in the meantime, don't take any more loans from banks as it funds their activities. And that includes mortgages, which is really just a loan. But yeah, everything else about job loss is just a bunch of nonsense. If you study Andrew Jackson, you'll realize that power is worth more than money. Take the slave trade, for example, where power clearly supersedes money. And also, I think it would be good if public officials were regularly drug tested by the public. Now, it's not enough for you to know about this. It's important to tell your family about this kind of subversion and intentional killing of jobs. How they put the poison in different countries to take control and designate their futures. And by that, I basically mean all countries, because it seems like China was actually the last holdout. There's evidence to suggest that they infiltrated governments all over, even in ancient times. Now, a lot of those other channels haven't dug far enough into history to show it, but the evidence seems to suggest that a one-world government has existed since long ago. But to understand that, we gotta go back to ancient Sumeria and explain something called the Sumerian swindle. So here's the rules to the game developed by the moneylenders of old. And by that, I'm not even talking about any Jews. Number 1, all interest on a loan of money is a swindle. That's their real bread and butter. You see, by charging interest, you gradually take real wealth away from the people. Number 2, collateral that's worth more than the loan is the banker's greatest asset. Number 3, loans rely on the honesty of the borrower, but not the lender. Number 4, loans with silver repaid with something other than silver forfeits the collateral. So basically, if you hoard all the silver to yourself to the point where they can't pay you in silver, you get their stuff. Number 5, the debitor is the slave of the lender. Number 6, high morals impede profits. So drag the virtuous to depravity beneath that even of the moneylenders. Number 7, monopoly gives wealth and power, but monopoly of money gives the greatest wealth and power. Number 8, large crime families are more successful than lone criminals or gangs. International crime families are most successful of all. Number 9, only the most ruthless and greedy moneylenders survive. Only the most corrupt banks triumph. Number 10, time benefits the banker and betrays the borrower. Number 11, dispossessing the people brings wealth to the dispossessor, yielding the greatest profit for the bankers when the people are impoverished. In other words, poor starving people are forced to take loans to survive, stripping them of what little wealth they have left faster and enslaving them. Number 12, all private individuals who control the public's money supply are swindling traitors to both people and country. Number 13, all banking is a criminal enterprise. All bankers are international criminals, so secrecy is essential. To me, this is sort of positive, because it means that all the population has to do is wake up and stay woke to protect itself. Number 14, anyone who is allowed to load at interest eventually owns the world. Number 15, loans to friends are power, loans to enemies are weapons. Number 16, labor is the source of wealth. Control the source and you control the wealth. Raise up labor and you can pull down kings. Number 17, kings are required to legitimize a swindle, but once that fraud is legalized, those very kings must be sacrificed. Number 18, when the source of goods is distant from the customer, profits are increased both by import and export. Number 19, prestige is a glittering robe for ennobling treason and blinding fools. Number 20, champion the minority in order to dispossess the majority of their wealth and power, then swindle the minority out of that wealth and power. Number 21, control the choke points and master the body, strangle the choke points and kill the body. Now, the Semitic king Sargon the Great, or Sargon of Akkad, was brought to power by the funding of Semitic moneylenders. He would go on to take over Sumeria and beyond, and give the Semitic moneylenders free reign to exploit the people. As a result of this exploitation and being ruled by foreigners, this empire had to put down many rebellions before it finally fell apart. The dynasty fell, but the moneylenders still had their loot collected over centuries. Now, Sargon and the Semitic moneylenders weren't Jews. At this point in history, they were Semites and they were a mafia, but that's all. You see, Semites are a pretty wide group of people that includes Arabs, so that whole anti-Semitic meme is a bit silly. In fact,
well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic.
And besides, the anti-Semitism card shows hatred towards all other breeds of humans. It implies special privileges and thereby classifies everyone else as subhumans. Now, around 1700 BC, Egypt was also taken over by a coalition mostly composed of Semites, and they installed one of their own as king. Leading up to this takeover, they had been gradually introducing Canaanite sleeper cells into the region. Of course, Canaan was the region containing the people of Israel and Judea, but they didn't yet exist as a distinct people. But either way, what followed was the exploitation of the Egyptian people. But after over a century of this, the Egyptian people finally got their balls together enough to give these foreigners the boot. But once again, they walked away with a good chunk of the wealth of the country. And using their accumulated wealth, they were able to establish the trade empire of Phoenicia. And they would travel all along the Mediterranean coast, bleeding out economies with their Sumerian swindle. Their name, by the way, came from a super expensive purple dye that they had a monopoly on. The Greeks called it phoenix, and it came to be a symbol of nobility and prestige in Europe. Now, an important thing to remember is that these money-lending merchants were well organized. They had their own secret guilds, which allowed them to function as a unit. In this way, for example, they could manipulate the supply of gold and silver by hoarding it, thus creating economic booms and recessions and profiting from both. In the case of recessions, they would often force whole countries to go to war just to steal another land's wealth in order to pay their debts, which is exactly what they did in Assyria. The country invaded so many lands and spread itself so thin that it just fell to every other empire to pass through. I guess you could say they weren't being taken as seriously anymore, and the moneylenders with their loot laughed all the way to the banks, which they owned. Speaking of which, they promoted the wars, but they bought their way out of having to do any of the actual fighting. But anyways, about 200 years after the Semites were kicked from Egypt, a group of bandits called the Aparu, or Hebrew, started raiding all over Canaan. Hebrew was just the Egyptian word for basically poor people. In fact, at the time, they invited anyone who wanted to get into that pillaging of the villages to join their ranks. Now, what happened was, the moneylenders of the city of Ur decided that they needed a place of their own to store their wealth, and they found it in the city of Jerusalem, where a man named Abraham invited the Hebrews to settle down. account. Abraham was the son of Terah, said to be the leader of the moneylenders of the city of Ur. And ... Abraham became the patriarch of the Hebrew tribes. And eventually, many of these tribes left this land to arrive at far-flung places. There's evidence of this in bloodlines all over, such as the Chiang people of China or the Kaifeng Jews. And real quick, let's not forget that in addition to the Sumerian swindle, they also had access to the opium of the people, with the drugs used dating back to at least 3400 BC. And as I've shown, the drug was used to subvert China relatively recently, and I'm highly doubtful if that was the first time it was used that way. But anyways, yeah, the lost tribes of Israel can be found all over, such as the B'nai Menashe tribe of India. In Somalia and Djibouti, there's the Ibru Abdul Ki. Ethiopia has the Phallus Mora. There's the Pathan House of Afghanistan, and many names in Kashmir sound biblical. You got the Ibu tribe of Nigeria, and the Lembas tribe of Southern Africa just might be. So clearly they had spread out and settled all over the old world. In fact, let's have a look at Japan. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a tribe of Israelites took over the leadership in ancient Japan. For one thing, there's countless parallels between the early Jewish religion and Japanese Shintoism. In fact, Shinto shrines are set up quite similarly to God's tabernacle. Not to mention you can find some very familiar symbols within them. And their first emperor, Jimmu, more like Emperor Jimju if you ask me. Now this is the mark on Herod's Gate in Jerusalem, and this is the crest of the Imperial House of Japan. So I think this brings us to the obvious question, should the Jews fear the samurai?
表に顔を見せない。侍の全く逆。
It sure looks like the samurai goyim know, but if you think about it, war is a good way to kill off a country's best and bravest. Not to mention associating honor with killing yourself. I mean, in World War II, they were handing out knockoff katanas like, look at you, you're a samurai, now go fly your plane into some Americans. But that was of course after official European contact. Speaking of which, many historians say that opium was introduced to the country around the 1400s, but I'm not so sure anymore. Either way, there's a connection here that's hard to deny. Now I think it's time we took a crack at the origins of the most prominent group calling themselves Jews today, the Ashkenazis. Now the Khazars were a semi-nomadic tribe living around the area of modern-day Ukraine. This group would go on to adopt the Jewish religion and presumably become the Ashkenazi tribe. But why? Well, this is what whistleblower Benjamin Freeman has to say.
They were a warlike tribe that lived deep in the heart of Asia. And they were so warlike that even the Asiatics drove them out of Asia into Eastern Europe. They set up this big Khazar kingdom. 800,000 square miles. Only there was no Russia, there were no other countries, and the Khazar kingdom was the biggest country in all Europe. Now the king became so disgusted with the degeneracy of his kingdom that he decided to adopt a so-called monotheistic faith. He said, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and he picked out so-called Judaism. And that became the state religion, and he sent down to the Talmudic schools of Palumbitha and Surah, and brought up thousands of these rabbis with their teachings, and he opened up synagogues and schools in his kingdom of 800,000 people, 800,000 square miles, and maybe 10 to 20 million people, and they became what we call Jews. There wasn't one of them that ever had an ancestor that ever put a toe in the Holy Land.
Now I have a real hard time believing that their king chose to make his people Jewish on a mere whim. Now according to what's called the Shetzer letter, Jews had been migrating to Khazaria from Armenia and Persia to flee prosecution. Also in the letter, the king who would commence the mass conversions was named Sabriel, which is quite possibly the Hebrew name of King Bulam. Also, his wife was considered a Jew in the letter, and females make the best agents.
References to members of the royal family should be very rare, very sparing, and very respectful.
Now before I start talking about the royals, I just want to say that this is truly going all out. No other channels are willing to go this far. So basically, we're getting into the really reals here, so stay sharp. Now these days, the royal families tend to portray themselves as something between relics and national treasures, hiding out in dusty old castles while publicly elected officials do the governing. But remember the Sumerian swindle, and that it's better to run things behind the scenes than it is to make a target out of yourself. Now what exactly is a prime minister? Which of course is the title of the highest ranked official in most old empire and colony states. Well, the term minister is derived from Latin to mean basically servant or attendant, so a prime minister means primary attendant. I think you know where I'm going with this.
The Queen is legally entitled to meet the Prime Minister once a week. If she can't meet him in person, she's allowed a telephone conversation. During these meetings, she's allowed to discuss anything she wishes, any matter at all. However, whatever she does discuss is kept completely confidential from the rest of the public. We do not have a right to know what she discusses on her behalf.
Personally, I think that the royal butt wipe deserves the title, but these guys do their part. I mean, if they weren't gonna do their part, they'd have never made it onto the ballots in the first place. Well, either that or the election's rigged, they get JFK'd, etc., etc. Which is why voting is a bunch of crap. It's just a big song and dance to occupy the public and make them feel like their opinions matter. Every vote cast is really just a vote to legitimize this nonsense. So in the big picture, just how powerful are these royals within the mafia? Well, consider this. With the exception of the Queen of England, the royals get less media coverage than the big banker families. Speaking of which, the House of England made use of the Rothschilds and the Sassoons before they ever intermarried. Now think about this. Is the world still ruled by nobility? Let's not forget that many monarchs and royals have special privileges, such as the rules against lese majesty, which means criticisms of them or even a simple joke can be seen as a crime. And then there's something called absolute inviolability, which as far as I can tell means they can be investigated but not prosecuted for crimes. Although these rules of course vary by country, but you get the idea. Now let's look at a couple modern day royals and see what they're up to. Former Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands has a fair-sized stake in Dutch royal shell, an oil giant with associations with the Roths. She's also a member of Bilderberg Group, her dad Prince Bernhard being their co-founder. The main family of Spanish royals are members as well. Of course, the group's been talked about to death at this point, but the point is all the people that it connects them to. Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein owns LGT Banking Group, a bank that's been accused of being a big-time tax haven. Whatever the case may be, Hans is known as Europe's wealthiest monarch. Mohammed VI of Morocco is the country's leading banker and businessman. His family is the major shareholder of SNI, which controls many major businesses in Morocco, including its own bank. King Hamad of Bahrain, like many of Arab royalty, traveled to England for part of his schooling. In fact, he gets on well with British royalty, but also the two big presidents. It's a very similar story with other royalty of the region, and they all exercise openly quite a bit of power over their respective countries. King Mswati III of Swaziland also went to school in England. His country has the lowest life expectancy in the world, mostly due to AIDS. The man sure lives it up though, with his wealth and hand-picked wives. He's also taken the time to visit the English royal family. The Sultan of Brunei is the official richest monarch in the world. He's got a great deal of control over the wealth of the state, and he's also got many connections to England. Now about the UK, their royal family is called the House of Windsor, but that's only because of a little name change though. In reality, they're a part of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha bloodline. And with that, you can see just how interconnected the royals of Europe are, with many of them being first cousins. As they say, it's best to keep it in the family. In actual fact, royals are a pretty tight-knit group, and they keep other big-name families in the mix as well. Like how a man named David Sassoon is the primary fashion designer for the females of the House of Windsor. Or how the great Lord Chamberlain has the blood of both Rothschild and Sassoon. Now Prince Philip has the blood of Mountbatten or Battenberg on his mother's side, another bloodline that goes back into the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Like when I say tight-knit, I mean there's a lot of incest going on to varying degrees. Furthermore, the royals often intermarry with members of the House of Hesse, a family which had given the Rothschilds the privilege of handling their finances way back a couple centuries ago. Needless to say, the Rothschilds really took off from there, and they stayed real friendly with the royals. Another banker family being connected to the royals are the Goldsmiths, Catherine the Duchess of Cambridge's mother being one. In fact, if you really care to dig, you can find lots of different Jewish bloodlines in royalty. As an example, let's look at Prince Philip again. His great-grandmother, Julia Hawk, is thought to be a Jew. Now with Princess Diane, the story goes that her mother had an affair with a goldsmith, and she's thought to be the product of it, which would also make her related to several Roths. But assuming it's true, I don't think it gained her any free passes in that family. But if it's not true, it would mean that she's a direct descendant from the 5th Earl John Spencer, a groom of the stool. But apparently, Diane's maternal grandmother also fulfilled that role. But either way, after her death, a letter was brought up in court, where allegedly Diane wrote to her butler about how she knew that Prince Charles was planning to kill her in an auto accident. Dodi Fayed, her boyfriend at the time, also died in this car crash. His father was convinced that it was premeditated, even financing a movie that wasn't allowed to be formally released. But yeah, if there was a reason why she would be killed, it's probably because she talked a little too much. But anyways, a couple years back, Prince Charles got caught writing letters to government covering a wide variety of issues. Now another monarchy to consider is the one at the Vatican, where the Pope is actually a king who wields at least soft power over the 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world. That's a lot of weight to be pushing around, and he owes it to guys like Charlemagne, who hacked and slashed their way into Christianizing Europe. But anyways, the Pope is backed up by the black nobility families. These are families that historically benefited tremendously by dealing with the Vatican, and I think it's no fluke that at the end of World War II, the Italian House of Savoy got abolished, while today the papacy is still going strong. Now the Vatican are said to be the true owners of the Bank for International Settlements started by the Rothschilds, the central bank of central banks, with just about all central banks in the world being privately owned, mostly by the Rothschilds and their lieutenants, of course. Now, the BIS is most notoriously known for being full of Nazi Germans during World War II, and there's some evidence to suggest that this bank was being used to actually fund the German war machine. Now, in the Jesuit order, their leader, the Superior General, is also known as the Black Pope, and the Jesuits themselves are known for certain black operations, such as the Gunpowder Plot, where they tried to blow up the House of Commons in England to help promote religious tolerance of Catholics. Also, Epic Fail Guy was there. Now, the first Black Pope and co-founder of the Jesuits was Ignatius of Loyola. His personal secretary, Juan Alfonso de Polanco, was known to be of Jewish descent. Same goes for the second Black Pope, Diego Lainez. Now, in 1776, the Jesuit order sent out Adam here to help form the Illuminati of Bavaria, a society that was connected to, and you might even say controlled, certain Mason lodges. They didn't last long in Bavaria, however, being accused of having revolutionary tendencies. Shortly afterwards, the French Revolution began, and after that, the Napoleonic Wars, a kind of proto-World War where the French somehow held their own against basically the entire rest of Europe for years. Imagine that. This war also made a certain banker family very wealthy indeed, and the Rothschilds would go on to become the guardians to the papal treasure, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia. You can draw your own conclusions there. So as I already said, the government is really just a front for the royalty mafia. It's just there to give the public some peace of mind. This is the most dangerous information that no one else seems willing to say. And here is the most important detail of all. For centuries, they've used hate in order to get people to kill each other. And it's not just about dividing and destroying the Goyim.
And he's got pictures of Hitler and Japanese and things all. I said, boy, Hitler must have been a hell of a guy. He said, Hitler was terrible. I hate him. I hate him. I said, why do you hate him? He said, I'm a Jew. I said, well, why do you enshrine this guy? Is he your daddy? And he looked up to his mother's fear. And his mother's fear was Hitler. Hitler was like his father figure. He loved Hitler, but he hated Hitler. He needed Hitler to hold him up, because Hitler was holding his hate up, because without his hate, he didn't exist.
History shows that the Mafia has little concern for low levels, but with hate they make use of them all the same. But yes, war is just an old game played between nobility, and they never did stop playing. With each war, they send off a generation's best to die, and you wonder why British men are ugly. I mean, back in the day, they had them bunch up in a neat line that made sure that the enemy can't miss. Now, with all this in mind, I think it's time we talked about what really happened during World War II. So what about them evil Nazis? Was Hitler a real human being? Well, one thing that you gotta understand about the Nazi Party is that they were all connected with the Catholic Church. And by the way, all religion is a form of mind control, the same as any other ideology. Nazism was no different, although it was really just socialism. And just like every two-party system today, Nazism and Zionism are two sides of the same coin. Two ideologies that seem to oppose each other but ultimately serve the same ends. Just remember what I said about hate. Now, Hitler's party really took after the Roman Catholics, with the SS being based on the Jesuit order. But their connection was stronger than that. In fact, the Holy See and the German Reich had signed a Concordat right after Hitler became Chancellor. And for example, in Article 16 it states that German Catholic bishops should be loyal to the German Reich. And in Article 21 it states that Catholic educators should teach kids National Socialist values. Values that the Church didn't seem to be in terrible conflict with, seeing as Pope Benedict grew up in the Hitler Youth. Now, another thing to consider is that 20th Century Fox was there helping the Nazis make the propaganda films. And within these films, one thing that very much stands out is the mention of a new order. You see, Hitler professed this plan of desiring a new order of Europe, a European Union, you might say, where everyone gets to live under the same brand of socialism. And the Jesuits didn't seem totally opposed to the idea either, considering that they were heavily involved with a Nazi puppet state in Czechoslovakia. The Jesuit priest Joseph Tiso having quickly rise through the government ranks to become president of that state. And in Croatia, they were allied with Ante Pavelic, who appeared to have been connected with the Jesuits. And according to an Italian whistleblower, at the end of the war, he was alleged to have sent huge amounts of confiscated gold to the Vatican Bank. Gold that allegedly ended up in Spain and Argentina, both countries he would later spend some time in before finally dying from injuries from a failed assassination. Now, the English royals also had some connections with the Nazis. You can't blame them for liking the uniforms though, they are pretty boss. Anyways, Charles Edward, a former English prince, became a member of the Nazi Party. Many people have theorized that he functioned as a sort of go-between, seeing as the royal family officially disowned him. In fact, in 1936, he went back to England as president of the Anglo-German Friendship Society and reported back that the aristocracy society had pro-German feelings. And then there's Edward VIII, who was known as a big-time Nazi sympathizer. He had to abdicate the throne after less than a year of reign though, possibly because he was just bad for the narrative. And on that note, fun fact, during World War I, the reigning monarchs of both Germany and England were first cousins through their grandmother, Queen Victoria. Now I've already mentioned how the BIS was in largely German hands during the war, but there was also an English banker named Montagu Norman, who at the time was the governor of the Bank of England. Well, as a member of the BIS, he authorized the transfer of 23.1 tons of gold out of Czechoslovakia's account and into Germany's. He also happened to be a member of the Anglo-German Fellowship, and he was a personal friend of the president of the Central Bank of Germany, Helmer Schett. Now, the actual president of the BIS at the time was an American banker named Thomas McKittrick. He was friends with Alan Dulles, an American intelligence agent who during the war was stationed at Bern, Switzerland. Now, apparently, McKittrick passed along information that he had garnered from the Nazis at the BIS. In particular, BIS director Emil Pohl. He was a big player in the moving of Nazi gold, which had been looted during the war. Now, supposedly, according to declassified intelligence documents, McKittrick was heavily involved with Nazi industrialists and helped to cut a lot of deals that would make sure that the German economy would stay strong, such as alleged deals with Standard Oil through the Chase Bank, which also appeared to have allowed the Nazis to loot French bank accounts after the country fell by routing the money through South America. In fact, the Uruguayan embassy apparently snitched that Chase was handling transactions for the Banco Alemán Transatlantico, a South American subsidiary of the German Deutsche Bank. Now, Standard Oil is a Rockefeller company, with the company's president during the war being William Stamps Ferris II. He had been a central player in creating a partnership with the German company IG Farben. And as you can see here, the other company involved was Henry Ford's General Motors. Farben was a German pharmaceutical and chemical giant that had functioned as a major Nazi government contractor. And as it happens, Hermann Schmitz, the CEO of IG Farben at the time, was also a BIS director. So long story short, there was quite a degree of cooperation between the American and German business world. Also, despite continuous Allied bombing, factories, especially those associated with Ford and IG Farben, were left largely untouched. In fact, the German war machine's production capacity had actually increased by war's end. Meanwhile, Standard Oil had assisted the US in planning out firebombings of Berlin, where the IG Farben building wasn't only left standing, but it was turned into the Supreme Allied Command headquarters. So I guess at the end of the day, Henry Ford's international Jew might have done a little shilling for his own benefit. So back on the topic of the Vatican, and by the way, I was raised Catholic myself. In addition to the Nazis, the Vatican also seemed infatuated with the idea of a new order. Just look at Pope Benedict, who again grew up in the Hitler Youth.
Pope Benedict XVI is calling for a new world financial order.
Now to this day, the Vatican continues to play a central role in world events. And if you wonder how powerful they are, remember the Pope has his own personal army of Swiss guards. Switzerland being a country closely associated with and possibly even founded by the Knights Templar, an order which was connected to the Pope and some say were the first real banksters of Europe. A lot of their initial capital coming from the looting of the Middle East during the Crusades. Now another example of the Vatican's position in the Mafia is that the likes of Henry Kissinger have served as the Pope's advisor. So now what about Hitler, the so-called man who fought the bank? Well, the fact is, Hitler's body was never found. And all we got were these low-res pictures that I don't find too convincing. In fact, the Russians claim to have kept some skull and jaw fragments of the guy, but when they actually ran tests, it turned out to be a female of a younger age. As a matter of fact, the Nazis had not only a bank in South America, but also several businesses. Now the rumor is that when Berlin fell, the Jesuits smuggled him from church to send him on his way to Argentina. This can be backed up by a released Federal Bureau document that seems to point to a place called La Falda. But anyways, the German people had served their purpose for the Mafia, and now they would be left to a pretty gruesome fate. For one thing, there was Eisenhower's open-air Rhine Meadows camps. Apparently, the terrible Swedish Jew reclassified German POWs as disarmed enemy forces in order to circumvent the Geneva Convention. And then, well, they really didn't do much at all. They just fenced them in and took potshots at them while they starved to death. According to different sources, including the book Other Losses, about 1 to 1.9 million Germans died in this fashion. And although the official narrative is to deny that this happened, the POW forms from back then were suspiciously destroyed. And then there's Operation Keelhaul, where the British handed over to the Soviets basically all people that they encountered that had originated from Russia, including POWs who had fought for Germany as a way of resisting Stalin and communism, but also countless Soviet POWs in Germany, who had ignored orders to commit suicide rather than be captured, and as such faced a bullet upon their return as traitors. Many such cases were also forced to fight for Germany, but also to work in German work camps. At any rate, most of these Soviets were none too interested in returning back home.
There can be no doubt that it was Anthony Eden who pushed the policy through Cabinet. It was his remarks that led to the implementation of the policy in a much less sympathetic way than could otherwise have been, and led to its broadening from soldiers to women and children, and to involving in the end several millions of people, many of whom had not collaborated with the Germans at all.
In fact, when they heard that they were being sent back, a lot of them couldn't kill themselves fast enough.
In the camps, the mood was desperate. soldiers committed suicide rather than face being returned to Russia.
They cut themselves. Bled like pigs all over the place.
But back on the topic of how the native Germans were treated after the war, according to quotes from American General George S. Patton, over 1 million Germans were displaced from their homes and untold numbers were exported into slavery. He actually thought it would be best to rearm Germany and join them in taking down the Soviets right then and there. But obviously the Mafia had other plans. As for Patton, he got to the point of comparing Nazis to Republicans and Democrats. The way he was going and the fact that as an accomplished general, people had respect for his words caused some problems. Eventually, the man had a date with a truck, after which he was left hospitalized and he died days later of a probable embolism. But yeah, this war accomplished a few things, chiefly being the establishment of a settlement in Palestine, which was largely made possible by the outwardly anti-Jew policies of the Nazi Party. In addition to the refusal of asylum for Jews in many Western nations, it effectively served to corral them into this project of theirs. And another thing about war is that by its very nature it destroys evidence. It's pretty hard to see the bigger picture when you're always sifting through the rubble, and there's no doubt in my mind that the Mafia is well aware of this. But at any rate, one thing that certainly didn't stay buried was the stated goal of a new world order.
If all men and women, whatever the differences between them, cling to the truth with respect for the unique dignity of every human being, a new world order, a civilization of love can be achieved.
It is a big idea, a new world order.
Work on a better world order.
A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
Overall strategy for America in this period, when really a new world order can be created, it's a great opportunity.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Now, before I get into anything else, I think it would be best to talk a bit about some of the major families. So now, what about all the different families that are supposedly at the top of the heap in this mafia? The most well-known among them has got to be the Rothschild banking dynasty, who basically issues the money. They've certainly got lots of friends in royalty, politics, and business. In fact, they've got their hands into just about everything. Supposedly, this family gained so much money and influence in the first place by spreading out to every financial center of Europe. That way, they could coordinate and profit from any situation, but especially war, which there happened to be quite a lot of in the 200 or so years that they've been a big name.
Is central to Rothschild mythology. By obtaining the first news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, before even the government itself, Nathan was able to make a huge sum of money on the stock exchange.
Next we've got the Sassoons, a so-called Iraqi Jewish family who again played a big part in the opium trade. Well, they're also said to have set up the central banks in India and China. In fact, when they were building the Bank of China building in Shanghai, Victor Sassoon made them cut the design nearly in half so that it wouldn't be any taller than his building next door. Their family is actually said to have come from Spain, where they were called the Shoshuns, and that they were forced to leave when the Muslims, who were tolerant of Jews, lost influence in the region. Now, for some reason, despite mixing with several prominent bloodlines and being clearly big players themselves, they're not included in the so-called 13 families. For that matter, where's the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha? I think the big issue here is their involvement with the East India Company, which according to a couple different sources was primarily Jewish owned and run out of the city of London. And naturally, the Roths and other big families can be connected with this company, but the Sassoons were really on the front line, so to speak. Anyways, another family that's closely connected with the Sassoons is the Rubin. Now, the next family that I want to talk about is the Oppenheimer family, best known for playing a huge part in the diamond and gold industry in South Africa. Since colonial times, many members of this family have spent a good part of their lives in Johannesburg, also known as Joburg. Now, back in 1917, Ernst Oppenheimer founded Anglo-American PLC with the backing of J.P. Morgan, and with that, bought enough shares to take control of De Beers Mining Company, which for quite some time had a complete stranglehold on the diamond trade. Next up is the Goldsmiths, or the Goldsmiths, depending on which side of the English Channel they're on. These guys mixed with other bloodlines, and they're big in banking. They're basically lesser Rothschilds. The House of Morgan is a prominent banking family and well known as one of Rothschild's agents in America. But the biggest family of such description has got to be the Rockefellers, best known for monopolizing on oil for decades with Standard Oil and having controlling shares of Chase Bank. The Warburgs are a German banking family, said to have been involved with IG Farben and intelligence operations in the region, but also they had quite some involvement in the United States, as you'll see. The Oppenheims are yet another German German Jewish financial dynasty, with Max von Oppenheim being implicated in the First World War jihad experiment. Another German Jew banker family is Goldman Sachs, said to be one of the Rothschild front families. Then there's the Yefersi family, a Ukrainian Jewish banking and oil dynasty. They've also been huge in the grain industry. Another major German family is the Mendelssohns, with Moses Mendelssohn being a big player in what was called the Age of Enlightenment, a key event of which was the French Revolution. They also had their own major banking house based out of Berlin. Next is the French Jewish Fold financial dynasty, who are also big into wine. The Bleschrotter family, Prussian court Jews / bankers. The Arnold family, German Jews with lots of business interests in China, where they're close with the Sassoons. The Bischofsheim family of German-Belgian Jews, another banking family that's particularly close with the Goldsmiths. Anyways, there's lots of these types of families, and they are a pretty tight-knit group. Rather than competing against each other, they more often than not intermarry and consolidate. Same thing with the main monarch families of Europe. Not that those two types of families are mutually exclusive in the slightest either. It's really all just one big happy family. And let's not forget about the media giants like the Murdoch family. Now here's a couple more individuals you should definitely be aware of. Henry Kissinger is the guy who seems to just keep popping up everywhere you look. He's a former U.S. Secretary of State, and he can be connected with China, Vietnam, the Vatican, you name it. And he's been shown to have had his hand in several U.S. intelligence / black operations. Next is Zbigniew Brzezinski. This guy is a former security advisor to Jimmy Carter, and he's been heavily involved in different operations, especially in the Middle East. And he stayed heavily involved with U.S. policy right up until his death earlier this year. Especially through the use of U.S. foreign policy, these two have contributed greatly into creating the world as it is today. Now going back in time, Cecil Rhodes, who was financed by the Rothschilds, largely established the diamond industry in southern Africa. He was first chairman of the De Beers Mining Company and gave his name to the state of Rhodesia. Now Albert Pike, a famous Freemason from the 19th century, allegedly predicted all 3 world wars. Now given how long ago this was, it's hard to say with any good degree of certainty if this was true. But the prediction basically states that the Third World War will consist of Islam and Zionism mutually destroying each other. But you know, even if he had access to some kind of secret sauce, I doubt they could have predicted things too accurately that far out. In reality, they just need a big war, probably the biggest ever, but definitely not the longest. Adam Smith is sometimes referred to as the father of economics. In other words, this man generated a lot of ideological pseudoscience for taking people's money. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations and was involved with the British East India Company. And it just so happens that Emma Rothschild would be the one to try to clean up his image with her own book. According to a couple sources, Adam was actually a personal advisor to Amichel Mayer in setting up the Rothschild international banking empire. But anyways, now let's look at the product of another so-called great mind of that era, the Soviet experiment. So the Russian Mafia is often called the most dangerous mafia in the world, and the most dangerous man, their leader, Simeon Mogilevich. But of course, in my opinion, there's only one mafia. As a matter of fact, like the vast majority of Russian mobsters, Mogilevich has a Jewish heritage. He's also an Israeli citizen and acts as the head of the so-called Red Mafia. Now back in 1994, Mogilevich allegedly gained control over Inkombank, one of the largest private banks in Russia, a bank that was connected to many of the Russian oligarchs and also the Rothschild Bank in London. And as proof of Mogilevich's power, he's known to have complete control over the Hungarian arms trade, which includes nuclear materials. And let's talk about nukes for a second, seeing as control over them represents a position of power. So it follows that the raw material, uranium, is mined in places where the Mafia has strict control. As you can see, much of it comes from former Soviet states, with Kazakhstan being the biggest producer, which would suggest that much of the Mafia's power is centered in Russia. Now let's go back to the turn of the century and the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a largely Jewish movement. This revolution knocked down Tsar Nicholas II, who supposedly had been trying to get rid of the Jews in Russia. Of course, I think it's safe to assume that the vast majority of Jews in Russia are Ashkenazis from Ukraine. You know, converted Khazars. And speaking of which, Kazakhs appear to be the descendants of unconverted Khazars. Kazakhs are fairly militaristic people, and as such, Russia has made good use of them for both waging war and defending their border regions. That is after Genghis Khan with a coalition of similar tribes just rolled over everyone. It's all about who's in charge, you know, and the Ashkenazis are led by the House of David. Anyways, after this revolution, a man named Vladimir Lenin seized power. A man of Jewish heritage who pushed an ideology first drafted by a German Jew. And Lenin's right-hand man of sorts, Trotsky, was also a Jew. Now it's not like all of Russia was on board with this, so what followed right afterwards was the Russian Civil War and the Red Terror. They basically forced this ideology onto the region by any means, including mass killings and terror. This period was known as war communism, and you could still say real communism hasn't been tried until Stalin came along. Also, there were rumors, but I can't confirm if Stalin was a Jew, but he was surrounded by them, including his third wife. Now Stalin really took it to the max by forcing so-called collectivism, which really really just seemed to mean the government monopolizing everything and destroying whoever opposed them. As a result of this policy when it came to agriculture, even in Stalin's own words, his policies were responsible for the deaths of 10 million. In actual fact, it seems pretty evident that they forced famines as a tool to quell rebellions. And then there's the gulags, which were effectively forced labor for even minor offenses. And all too often they would be worked to death, especially during World War II. Estimates for how many died in these fashions is usually somewhere between 20 and 60 million, devastating the people of Russia and the Soviet bloc. And like what the Mafia always seems to do, special attention was paid to killing off their best. Now fast forward to the modern era, where control of Russian industry has largely fallen out of the hands of government and into that of the Russian oligarchs. Oligarchs like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was Russia's wealthiest man at one point. That is, until he was arrested in 2003. That's when he allegedly gave up his shares in the oil company Yukos to Jacob Rothschild. And now that he's out, he's shilling for something called Open Russia, an initiative with board members such as Rothschild and Kissinger. And with this initiative, Mikhail expresses opposition to Putin's style of government, Putin himself being allegedly connected with Simeon Mogilevich, that mobster that I mentioned earlier. And speaking of the Mafia, let's also remember that Russia has a huge drug problem, particularly of the opioid variety. And another thing to know about Putin is that he appears to have a sort of truce with the oligarchs for their mutual benefit. But anyways guys, I know it's important to spread the word, but I would avoid snitching on the Mafia in Russia. The Russian Illuminati is the most ruthless, that's why the people are so broken. So back on the topic of nukes, I think it would be a good idea to use the Mafia's own narrative against them and push to make the sale of uranium to Russia illegal. I mean, the media pretends to hate Russia, even though it's clearly a Mafia stronghold. And nukes are really being used to hold their own people and surrounding regions hostage anyways. Just like how the US has the power to basically glass all of North America. And the funny thing about this media narrative is that it actually looks like Russia is supporting US nuclear manufacturing by being a primary exporter of uranium to the States. But yeah, the main uranium producing companies are Cameco, short for Canadian Mining and Energy Corporation, the French multinational Areva, Paladin Energy, based out of Australia, Rio Tinto Group, based out of London and Australia, First Uranium Corporation, which was acquired by Anglo Gold Ashanti, and Berkeley Energy. Also, this is just a thought, but it is possible that nukes don't exist. The threat alone has power to the Mafia, and there is some funny business surrounding them.
From my point of view, majority of the people in the world is gangster. I think the police is gangster. I think the Prime Minister is gangster, but they are high-level gangsters.
So there really is only one Mafia, and it's obviously not the Italians like Hollywood likes to portray. When in fact, even back in the days of Murder Incorporated, organized crime in America was still dominated by Jews, with the biggest figure among them appearing to be Meyer Lansky, the so-called mob's accountant. You know, a harmless court Jew like the Rothschilds. As a matter of fact, it seems quite possible that the Sicilian Mafia itself is full of crypto Jews. But it's not the Jewish Mafia either. It's not even the Zionist Mafia. It's just the Mafia. I mean, even if the so-called Russian Mafia is full of Israeli and Ukrainian Jews, they're still just a front for the Mafia. I mean, for that matter, the way that they're running around with nukes, I would be too surprised if they were straight up Mossad agents. I mean, it's pretty fishy how people of former Soviet bloc countries are now being destroyed by opioids, with Eastern European girls being exported into sex slavery, with many of them being reported to end up in Israel. The Chinese triads have a couple obvious links with the Mafia. In fact, most of the triads are actually based out of Hong Kong, which was a prize taken during the Opium Wars. And as I've said, it's these very triads that Sun Yat-sen came out of with his dubious ethnicity, with his BFF Morris Cohan. Not to mention, Hong Kong cinema is well known to be owned by the triads. Now, the term triads comes from the Three Harmony Society, also known as the Tian Di Hui, or the Hongmen, a group that Sun Yat-sen was a senior figure within, and is still politically active in Taiwan, which is still technically the Republic of China. Now let's look at the Americas, say the MS-13 or the Sinaloa Cartel. Well, a lot of that goes back to destabilization in the region caused by American intelligence during the Reagan years. And that's a whole nother can of worms, but more recently, American intelligence and government have been alleged to be colluding with such groups. There actually happens to be a cartel in Mexico that straight up calls themselves the Knights Templar. Let's not forget that the original Knights Templar have a history every bit as bloody as what's going on in Mexico right now. Lastly, let's look at the Hells Angels, which is of course a famous motorcycle gang that was started in California, and was originally comprised of primarily war veterans. Not that that was unusual for the post-war era, but one thing Hells Angels are known for is disrupting anti-war protests. Another thing is helping to sell the Mafia's drugs, and by extension legitimizing the war on drugs, which sucks up tax money and fills jail cells. Hells Angels are also alleged to be connected with Freemasonry. Not that I'm saying that all Masons are complicit with the Mafia schemes, but historically a lot of high-ups have been. Anyways, let's talk about another monopoly that the Mafia has, the one on religion.
The bright red symbolizes the blood they're willing to spill in service of the Holy Father.
Religion, with its power to manipulate the masses, is something that the Mafia has long since established a monopoly over. Let's start with the Vatican, which really could be said to be a direct continuation of the original Roman Empire. In fact, a lot of people attribute the success of the religion in the first place to the Roman Emperor Constantine. Up until then, the Roman religion was a collection of different deities adopted from conquered lands. And at that particular time, the most popular god was the sun god, Sol Invictus. And what the Catholic Church did to gain widespread acceptance was bastardize Christianity with the Roman pantheon, with Jesus taking up the role of the sun god. In fact, the cross itself, like a lot of such symbols, can be found within older religions and cultures, such as that of ancient Egypt, where they had symbols and artifacts in the shape of the crux ansata, and they were used as a symbol of authority for priests of the Egyptian sun god. In fact, you could take it back even further to the Babylon god Tammuz. But anyways, the Vatican did whatever it took to dominate far and wide. The word Catholic itself comes from a Greek term that basically means universal, and they universalized by massacring and forcing conversions on surrounding populations. And then there's the matter of the Middle East. Alleged ex-Jesuit priest Alberto Rivera has stated that the Catholic Church wanted to take Jerusalem as early as the 3rd century, but at the time they were unable to convert or massacre the normie Christians or the Jews of the region. But they did manage to convert some Arabs, especially in North Africa, that they could use as agents. Now the story goes that through a widow named Khadija, they found a brilliant Arab youth that they could promote as a messiah. They sent teachers and mentors to this young man and had him study the works of St. Augustine, while having their Arab agents in North Africa spread the word of the coming of the chosen one. They told this man that the Jews and any Christians other than Roman Catholics were his enemies. The Roman Catholics helped Muhammad the whole way through basically, including providing shelter for his followers and funding his army. Now up until this point, the Kaaba in Mecca was for worshipping the moon god Hubal. It also appears to be a cube of Saturn, but we'll get to that later when I talk about symbolism. But anyways, when Muhammad took over Mecca, he removed the large statue of Hubal, along with idols of several other gods, symbolically and soon enough literally taking over religious life in the region with the monotheism of Islam. And even after his death, Arab generals in North Africa were given permission by the Pope to conquer lands to be Islamified. But apparently all this success started making these Muslim generals cocky. They took Jerusalem and kept it for themselves and even started asking the Pope's permission to take over European lands. This led to a long-term conflict that included the Crusades to Jerusalem. Although, and this is just my assertion, but this conflict might have been orchestrated on purpose for all the Mafia's standard reasons. Certainly, several Catholic knightly orders got very rich out of these conflicts. In fact, it even appeared to be what pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages, because now the Catholic nations had a common enemy, Muslims, but they also massacred Jews and non-Catholic Christians, whether they were Arab or otherwise. Now in Khazaria, which lasted from about the 7th to 10th century, they put up quite a fight against the Muslim caliphates. The country itself had the advantage of being one big toll booth because it lied on major trading routes between East and West. So while the Sephardics were being killed off and forced to convert / go crypto in the Middle East and Europe, these new Jews were on the way up. Khazaria did fall, of course, presumably because of the campaigning of Sviatoslav I of Kiev, but it was likely the Mongols who pushed them westward to establish themselves in Slavic and Germanic lands. Now these Jews became very prominent in European society. Even before Khazaria fell, they had mixed royal blood with the Byzantines. Certainly, many Ashkenazi bloodlines established themselves or were already established with the Mafia, just judging by their prominence today. Another thing to note is that today, the Ashkenazi population completely dwarfs that of the Sephardics and other Jews. Now there is a theory that Khazaria was an off-branch of the old Roman Empire. For one thing, let's look at Caesar, which is actually the wrong pronunciation of the man's name. In classical Latin, the letter C is exclusively pronounced with a hard K sound, so his real name is actually more like Kaiser, or if you like, Khazar. As a side note, the Russian Tsar position also comes from his name. Anyways, it doesn't take much study of history to know that leaders like to establish territories in their own name. Now according to an Arab source from back then, a good portion of the Khazar population was actually fair-skinned, blue or green-dyed, and red-haired, which would coincide with the stories of the legendary Red Jews. Now this combined with the history of the region seems to suggest that a good chunk of them were actually Indo-Europeans. But historians also believe that they shared a common language with the Bulgars and the Huns, whom they lived with, or at least nearby, and would also connect them with the early Mongols. But we'll talk more about that later. For now, let's go to India and take a look at Hinduism, which is definitely one of the oldest religions and one which others have taken inspiration from. But let's just look at the period when India was basically ruled over by the East India Company. During this time, it's believed that Hinduism was subverted by the stealing and rewriting of Vedic scripts, and that they were assisted in this by a purported crypto-Jew tribe called the Chitpavan Brahmin. To help back this up, some of the Bengali Hindu nobility was cooperating with the British East India Company, much to the detriment of their people. Now the biggest change these subverters are believed to have effected in Hinduism was to make ahimsa the greatest virtue, so basically non-violence and compassion, to the point of allowing these foreigners to take total advantage. Now Buddhism has been exported all across East Asia and at least as far west as Greece. It basically branched off from the proto-Hindu religion and started crossing borders. Now let's just look at some of the activity of Buddhists, such as the Tibetans. If we look back at the Yuan dynasty dynasty of China when the Mongols declared themselves rulers. They cooperated with the Tibetans to try to legitimize their rulership with the Buddhist ideology. The ruling Kublai Khan also made a Tibetan Buddhist the imperial preceptor, a title which basically means teacher to the emperor. Meanwhile, the Buddhist Shaolin monks actually fought for the Yuan. These guys are of course famous for their ridiculous lifelong martial arts training. Of course, they claim it's all about self-defense and exercise, but most of the moves that they're famous for are actually finishing moves, such as the Iron Palm or Monkey Grabs Peaches. Shaolin was a place where martial arts knowledge across China was collected and refined, and this kind of training was obviously painful and grueling and required more motivation than a mere hobby. So is it not possible that Shaolin was in fact an assassin's guild? For their time, they were basically unstoppable by anything short of an army. So if we look at America, we already know that most of the founding fathers were Masons. I mean, why would there be an anti-Mason party if the clubs didn't have a serious influence? But did you know some might also have had a hand in the French Revolution? Thomas Jefferson was there, and in 1779, Benjamin Franklin became master of the Lodge of Nine Sisters in Paris, a lodge that held key figures in both the French and American revolutions, which would quite possibly link them with the former Bavarian Illuminati. Benji was also a member of the nicknamed Hellfire Club in England, and I think it's no small coincidence that the Revolutionary War ended with the Treaty of Peace in 1783, otherwise known as the Treaty of Paris, which was actually a deal with London that seemed to favor the colonies, except for a little detail where the King of England is recognized as Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the United States. So sure, the Crown would give the US some autonomy, but it appears that they were still acting as monarch and Grand Treasurer of this little project. Revolutionary War? More like Revolutionary Door. Anyways, to my understanding, they did manage to get away from private central banks for a while. Again, I'll let you research Andrew Jackson on your own, but the point is, that little taste of freedom wasn't to last. You see, up until the American Civil War, the Rothschilds had been kinda slacking on the New World. This war wasn't really about slavery, except that it was debt slavery. It's also worth noting that Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon P. Chase, of the Chase banking family. So in 1962, the United States started issuing greenbacks, an unbacked currency, supposedly because they didn't want to be buried in debt to foreigners to pay for the war. Many people believe that Chase was a Rothschild agent, seeing as he pushed for the National Banking Act, which created a federally chartered central bank. And apparently Lincoln wasn't having this, and he started pushing Congress to shut down the central bank by the end of the war. But just as the war was winding down, bam, shot by John Wilkes Booth of the Booth acting family. And in addition to several conspirators, Judah P. Benjamin was also accused, but he fled the country at the end of the war. Judah, a Jew, was the Confederacy's Secretary of State and in charge of the Department of War and the Secret Service, which had previously run operations in an attempt to undermine President Lincoln. More importantly, he was close enough to Solomon Rothschild to be praised for his brilliance. Well, he certainly did seem to find his way into high places easily. Another theorized agent responsible was Thomas W. House, whose son became the advisor to Woodrow Wilson. At any rate, Lincoln was dead and fiat currency continued. President Garfield was the next to cause a stir, by rightfully declaring that those who control the money control business and the activities of the people. And 4 months into his term, he got shot at a train station. President McKinley was known as a hard money man, and he was against easy money with no backing. In 1901, he was assassinated by supposed Polish anarchist Leon What's-His-Face, even though Leon had been earlier called out as an infiltrator in the anarchist's own newspaper. By 1913, and with a lot of influence from Paul Warburg, the Federal Reserve was established. A full-on private central bank. Don't let the name fool you. You can thank Wilson for being a dum-dum and also supposedly getting blackmailed over an affair. He's also the president that got America into the First World War, despite keeping the moat being part of his campaign. But before we go any further, let's go back to the end of the Civil War and the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871, where Congress recognized the District of Columbia as a municipal corporation. The problem, though, is that a municipal corporation of Columbia was already created in an act in 1801. You can't just incorporate the same municipality twice, so this leads many people to believe that the act in 1871 was the creation of a private corporation by the existing municipality, and that by extension, the act to provide a government created a corporate government called the United States, one that proceeded to govern the American people in place of the original government of the United States of America, which, if true, and to me it seems to be, but judge for yourself, is a straight-up act of treason that they've been getting away with for over a century. Anyways, the banksters kept gaining power in the USA, with so-called hoarding of gold being criminalized in 1933. But then there was President John F. Kennedy.
Ladies and gentlemen, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, There is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
In 1963, President Kennedy signed an executive order that allowed the government to issue its own currency in the form of silver certificates. And then later that year, yeah, you already know, the official story was that a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible, and he got shot and killed himself 2 days later. Now there's evidence to suggest that George H.W. Bush, a CIA agent at the time, was president in Dallas that day. Now get this, in 1979 there was an assassination attempt on President Jimmy Carter in Los Angeles. The two men arrested were Raymond Lee Harvey and Oswaldo Ortiz. Now on the topic of H.W. Bush, he was vice president for Ronald Reagan, meaning he was acting president while Reagan was recovering from a bullet wound an inch away from his heart. If he dies, he dies. They also used this shooting to push gun control in the form of extensive background checks, as if that's not ripe for abuse. So you've probably guessed by now that the Cold War was fake. As a matter of fact, Leon Trotsky was in New York when the Tsar was overthrown, and Lenin was in Switzerland, but they both shot right over somehow to take the leadership. Max Warburg is the one believed to have made this possible through German intelligence, and as such that those two were agents directed to lead the party in a certain direction, a direction that would ultimately lead to a split between East and West with their opposing ideologies. Really, it was just divide and conquer, like always.
Когда религиозные верования себя исчерпали, одурачивание людей было переведено в плоскость светских идеологий, и последней такой мощной одурачивающей людей идеологией явился марксизм. И вот та реальная структура общества, в которой мы живем, нас пугают опять кривые зеркала там всякими измами, социализмами, демократизмами, капитализмами, монархизмами. Мы как...
There are these massive boxes of photographs of Russian industry after the revolution. They could not operate the plants. So what do we do with Averell Harriman and the Chase Bank and National Bank and our old friends on Wall Street? They go in there, and of course the Hoover Mission to feed Russia. We go in there and we have these 250, 300 concessions in which American companies went into Russia, and they started up the idle plants. Averell Harriman took the manganese concessions, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum took the pencil factories and the asbestos plants. And all these top capitalists went in and they got Russia going on behalf of the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks either shot or kicked out all the people who could run, all the Russians who could run the plants.
Now during the Vietnam War, with the North Vietnamese being the supposed proxy of the communist powers of China and Russia, according to many sources, the Rockefellers were making trade deals and loans with the Soviets. Now as I said, the Cold War was really just a production to keep the people divided. But what about the centerpiece of that production, the moon landing?
Go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again. But going to Mars should be...
The real problem with getting humans to the moon is something called the Van Allen radiation belt that you have to pass through to get there, and not to mention back. In fact, modern astronauts never seem to leave low Earth orbit. And back during the Apollo missions, it seems like they were just using their spaceship window to make the Earth seem further away than it was.
Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up. See the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window.
Also, shadows, guys. There's only one major light source on the moon's surface. So anyways, after Vietnam, there was conflict in the Middle East. This time it was U.S. intelligence arming and training Mujahideen fighters to repel the Russians in Afghanistan.
Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these Mujahideen, and that's great. Let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union.
إلا رد فعل للظلم المتواصل الذي يمارس على أبنائنا في فلسطين وفي العراق وفي الصومال وفي جنوب السودان وفي غيرها كما في كشمير وآسان.
So guys, I don't think that at this point many of you do, but if you still think that 9/11 was what they told us it was, well, let me see what I can do for you. Now first off, one thing you gotta understand about the Mafia is that a lot of them have autism, possibly to go along with all the other mental disorders they have from centuries of inbreeding. Anyways, they love their numbers, and they love leaving patterns when it comes to numbers. And I'll talk about this in more detail later, but September 11th, 1922 was when the British Mandate for Palestine began. A mandate that, in keeping with the Balfour Declaration, sought to establish a Jewish homeland. And of course, the events on the same date in 2001 set the wheels in motion for the Americans to tear up the entire region. Could it not be all for the benefit of their greatest ally? And by the way, there was plenty of Jews working in the building that morning, one notable exception being the building's owner, Larry Silverstein, the same man who was involved in the redesigning of Building 7 a year prior.
Next thing you know, we've got the designs of a building. And the first design meeting was in April of 2000. And construction began shortly thereafter in 2002. And we went to finance the building with Liberty bonds, construction bonds from the Liberty Bond program that was initiated by the federal government to enable us to rebuild the Trade Center.
But it wasn't until July 24th of 2001 that Silverstein actually even bought the World Trade Center. And 6 weeks before the attacks, he takes out a massive insurance policy that could cover them. He was also the one who claimed responsibility for pulling Building 7.
We're not sure they're going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Of course, you can tell by the shape that Building 7 wasn't one of the two buildings that was hit by airplanes. It was just kind of there. And as far as the ones that were hit, we're talking about aircraft-grade aluminum, which is a good compromise between weight and strength, but it's slamming right into the honeycomb-style solid steel frame of the WTC towers.
I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have.
The steel in the wreckage, by the way, was shipped off, mostly to China and India, before anyone could do a proper investigation. But anyway, Silverstein had a friend named Frank Lowy, who helped buy the WTC and had part ownership, and just happened to be a former soldier for the IDF, and basically bought a building for the Institute of National Security Studies. He's also close friends with Rupert Murdoch, just like Silverstein. Another name you should know is Louis Eisenberg, who headed the Port Authority that leased the WTC buildings. He's also a member of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and Trump named him as ambassador to Italy. Next, we've got Ronald Lauder, who was chairman of the New York Governor's Commission on Privatization. He personally lobbied for the privatization of the World Trade Center. He also caused the former Stewart Air Force Base to become privatized, which just happened to be the spot over which the two planes converged. Now, Lauder actually founded the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy. He's also known to be active in the Jewish National Fund, the World Jewish Congress, which he's currently president of, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the ADL, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. Naturally, he's also close with Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, setting up explosives, which I'll get to in a minute, requires having control over the security of the complex. And the Port Authority had given Kroll Associates the contract to run security, the owners of which were brothers Jules and Jeremy Krolls. And the managing director was Jerome M. Hauer, who from 1996 to 2000 ran the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, during which time he placed the primary emergency command center in Building 7. Now back to Kroll. Jerome hired former FBI Special Agent John O'Neill to be head of security at the World Trade Center. And in fact, his first and last day of work was on September 11th. You see, earlier O'Neill had been investigating an attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, an attack that Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for. I'll trust you to put two and two together on that. Now, at the airports that the hijackings originated from, the security was ran by ICTS International, owned by Ezra Harrell and Menachem Atzmon. In fact, the supposedly Dutch corporation's board of directors is filled with the chosen ones, and the company itself was largely founded by former members of Israel's Internal Intelligence Agency. Also, this company has been implicated in several other incidents of the same variety. Anyways, right before the Patriot Act was voted on, it was edited to make foreign companies in charge of security on 9/11 immune to lawsuits, meaning the courts couldn't demand testimony and surveillance video out of companies like ICTS, although this was called out in 2010 in what was called the Mariani motion. Now, 2 hours before the attacks, 2 employees of Odigo Messenger reportedly received forewarning of the events to come. Well, to be more specific, 2 employees reported it, the rest most likely passed it on. It makes sense because Odigo has a search feature that allows people to pass on messages based on nationality. And get this, estimates for the amount of Israelis that died in the attacks ranges from 3 to 5, with 2 of them having been on the planes. Also, Odigo's headquarters is in Herzliya, the same place as Mossad. Furthermore, Odigo was bought by another company called Converse in 2002. Converse's CEO being Jacob Kobe Alexander, but you can just call him Kobe. Anyways, Kobe's been charged with multiple counts of fraud related to the company. He also has ties to the Israeli Defense Force through his father, who also had the privilege of managing the National Oil Company. More importantly, many claim that he himself has links with Mossad. Now, believe it or not, but on September 10th, the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies gave a fairly specific warning about Mossad, saying they have the capability to target U.S. troops and blame it on the Arabs. It makes one wonder what they would have said about the USS Liberty incident if they managed to kill everyone on board. Anyways, according to a Fox News story, over 60 Israeli nationals were arrested on suspected espionage, all in the days surrounding and including 9/11. Although that number seems a little conservative, other sources have claimed that over 140 were arrested before the events even took place, and another 100 or so afterwards, including 5 that became known as the Dancing Israelis, named such because they appeared to be celebrating the attacks while documenting them. They were pulled over in a van and found with many suspicious items. Apparently, police even sent a bomb-sniffing dog to the van that reacted as if it had smelled explosives. They also reportedly told police that they aren't the problem, it's the Palestinians that are the problem. They later appeared on a talk show in their homeland and confirmed that they were there to document the event. There were several other white vans pulled over also, all belonging to a company called Urban Moving Systems, which is widely believed to be a front for Mossad. And then there's the infamous mural van that was later said to have been an innocent delivery truck, although it is possible that that particular van was a red herring to occupy police resources. Also, the owner of the company, Dominic Sutter, fled to Israel in between periods of questioning with the FBI. Now, as far as how the actual towers came down, according to experts in many fields, it had the appearance of a controlled demolition, most believing that it was at least primarily thermite or something similar that was used to cut through the structure. Apparently, there was even active thermite found in the dust afterwards. And even after several days, according to NASA heat imaging, there was hot spots reaching in excess of 800 degrees Fahrenheit in the rubble. Another thing to consider is that dust clouds were being blown horizontally hundreds of feet away from the building, which would take an incredible amount of internal pressure if it was just from the floors caving in, despite the fact that the building was basically in free fall the whole time. Not to mention these little puffs that were way ahead of the collapsing floors. They even snuck in a few while a plane hit the second building. And then there's Building 7 that was literally 300 yards away and across the street from the towers. The BBC has actually admitted to reporting the collapse of this building 26 minutes before it even happened, calling it an honest mistake. I guess that's one story where they should have pulled it till they were sure. But yeah, in Building 7 there wasn't even any jet fuel for melting steel beams. But yeah, let's go back to the first tower that was hit, cause there's not very much footage of it, but check this out. Some people actually think that the plane fired a missile, but it seems more likely to me that it was an explosion in the building to make sure that the plane could penetrate. And when it comes to the second plane, there's surprisingly little footage of it on the actual impact side, which does make sense because it's opposite to the previous impact, but that's awfully convenient. A few independent people still managed to get good shots though. Now look closely. This next one's really obvious. But this theory also raises a question: how could the planes fly into the buildings at the exact spot where they would be allowed passage? Well, the first plane hit the computer room of Marsh and McLennan. Marsh and McLennan was close with Kroll Associates, seeing as they would acquire them in 2004. Also, Kroll was run by a man named Michael Cherkasky, who would go on to be Marsh's CEO shortly after the takeover. Now, Paul Bramer, who at the time was CEO of Marsh Crisis Counseling, had an office there. Bramer had previously worked as a managing director at Kissinger Associates, and he went on to have a lot of involvement with the Iraq War. Anyways, the second plane hit Fuji Bank on floors 79 to 82. The same floors, we can clearly see some kind of molten metal flowing out of here. Now, you remember how the two flight paths converged over the privatized Stewart Airport? Well, the theory is that this is where these two planes were landed and swapped out with remote control drones. Drones that could be precision guided into transmitters that were set up in a specific room in each tower. One, of course, being in that Marsh and McLennan computer room, and the other somewhere in that Fuji Bank office space. To back this up, it's obvious enough that that pod, whatever it is, isn't something that comes standard on passenger planes. In fact, a lot of people think those weren't passenger planes at all, but military 767 tankers loaded to the brim with fuel.
It was a military plane.
And the plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
We watched the first explosion. As we're watching the buildings, I saw a black, very large airplane fly right into the second building. It came out of the south. It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Now, of course, at this point in time, remote control technology over airplanes had already been in existence for decades. And at the time, Rabbi Dov Zakheim was Undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller. Zakheim is the former CEO of SPC International, a subsidiary of Systems Planning Corporation, while at the same time he served as a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, within System Planning Corporation, which also works closely with the Department of Defense, their radar physics group had developed something called a flight termination system. They also came up with a command transmitter system, which together would allow airplanes to be controlled from hundreds of miles away. And by the way, this is what a flight termination system module looks like, so it's also possible that this was what the pod was. But also get this, the part of the Pentagon that was destroyed contained the Department of Defense's yearly budget information, along with the accountants, bookkeepers, and budget analysis that were working there that day. Now, as I said, Zakheim was comptroller, meaning basically he looked after the DoD's yearly budget, including the matter of the trillions of dollars that Donald Rumsfeld announced missing on September 10th. Anyways, you may have heard of Project for the New American Century, a so-called Washington-based foreign policy think tank. Well, before 9/11, they wrote a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And in a section called Creating Tomorrow's Dominant Force, it's basically said that the best thing that can happen to transform America's forces is a catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. An event which was more than a little fishy itself. So how about that bad joke called the 9/11 Commission? Well, according to John Farmer, who was the senior counsel to the commission, the NORAD tapes were radically different than what was told to them and the public. Former Senator Max Cleveland resigned for the commission in 2003, saying the White House has played cover-up. Now, the one with the highest position in the commission, the executive director, was Philip Zelikow. Originally, it was to be Henry Kissinger, but he was protested out. Anyway, Zelikow himself has a history of involvement with U.S. foreign policy, and he's like BFFs with Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under Bush. But yeah, there was a lot more maneuvering going on after 9/11 than this one dead-end commission. For example, Kenneth Feinberg was in charge of the $7 billion Victims Compensation Fund, having everyone who took the money waive the right to sue the rescue, recovery, and cleanup operations, as well as any private contractors and the city itself. And also a non-negotiable clause that they can never file a suit against the airlines. One might say that it was clearly shut-up money, and 97% of the victims did take it. The remaining minority that still pushed for a proper investigation had to deal with special mediator Sheila Birnbaum. Long story short, they got exactly nowhere. Now, Michael Chertoff was Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the Justice Department. Later, he became Director of Homeland Security. Chertoff is said to have been behind the removal of FBI agent Michael D., who was in the middle of investigating possible Israeli spies before and after 9/11. That second Michael was also allegedly harassed and unfairly portrayed as a potentially violent person of interest. It's also alleged that Chertoff was behind the sending back home of many Mossad agents that they had in custody. He also has a cousin named Benjamin Chertoff, who wrote an article in Popular Mechanics making fun of 9/11 conspiracy theorists. Another guy to know is Richard Perley, who was the chairman of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. Now, back in the 70s, when Perley was working in the office of Senator Henry Jackson, he was apparently caught leaking classified information to Israeli officials. Next, there's Paul Wolfowitz, who was Deputy Defense Secretary and a member of the Defense Policy Board at the Pentagon. Then there's Douglas Feith, who was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Feith worked on the National Security Council in the early 80s, but was allegedly kicked off that post over suspicions of working for Israel. Nevertheless, he quickly found a new post at the Pentagon and continued from there. And in 2002, him and Wolfowitz created the Office of Special Plans, which created such intelligence gems as Saddam has the bomb and he has close ties with Al-Qaeda, which is kind of funny because there was only one country in the region that fit that description, and it wasn't Iraq.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing. We thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq, and I also talked the need to advance a freedom agenda.
Next, we've got Elliot Abrams, who was a National Security Council advisor. He's also a member of the CFR, and like many of these people I've mentioned, he's an American Zionist. Ari Fleischer, a dual citizen, was the White House spokesman for Bush on 9/11. In fact, even Bush's own speechwriter, David Frum, is Jewish, and he's best known for coining the term axis of evil. Anyways, how about that Al-Qaeda? Well, first let's look at Adam Yahya Gideon. I guess you could say he was the head of Al-Qaeda's PR team, appearing in a lot of videos, basically taunting Americans. Adam is actually of Jewish descent, with his grandfather having been on the board of directors of the ADL, and his real name at birth being Adam Perlman. Now here you see two of the supposed hijackers, Ziad Jarrah and Mohammed Atta. They've been called the laughing hijackers for allegedly laughing hysterically about making their martyrdom video. Ziad Jarrah actually has a cousin named Ali Al-Jarrah, who was arrested in Hezbollah on accusations of being a longtime spy for Israel. Also worth mentioning is that Yusuf Al-Khattab, one of the leaders of Revolution Muslim, is actually a Jew whose former name was Joseph Cohen.
I spoke to this guy the whole night, and I couldn't sidetrack him. You know, as a Jew, you learn to try to be cunning. and how to push the people in your direction.
Now, as far as North America goes, they weren't necessarily trying to fit every such attack into just one day. There was the Sears Tower incident on October 16th, 2001, where a group of, quote, Middle Eastern-looking men were arrested in Pennsylvania for suspicious activity. And apparently it was in connection with a company called Moving Systems Incorporated. And apparently police found a video camera with footage of Chicago, and in particular shots of the Sears Tower. And before that, there was the Mexican incident on October 10th, where according to a local newspaper, they arrested 2 Mossad agents inside the Mexican Congress, and that they were armed with pistols, grenades, explosives, the whole 9 yards. Anyways, guys, I think it's time we moved on, but for the record, there's much more on that topic where that came from. So I'll just end this with a quote by former Italian President Francesco Khazarian.
Elon, are we responsible? Did we do 9/11?
Like, to be conquered.
To the U.S. military! Hoorah!
Yeah, funding the Israelis to kill the Palestinians.
Should I pee into the cup? A bottle, yeah. Oh, you emptied it. Oh, thanks, man.
Ari Shafir couldn't hold in his pee, ladies and gentlemen.
Couldn't means wouldn't.
Now let's talk about Israel.
Oh, gosh, I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks for all the support.
Oh, believe me, you'll always have my support.
I personally tried to edit things in Wikipedia that were against Israel, small things, and my changes were erased or undone, and I didn't understand why.
So you gotta wonder, rich Jews seem quite content in America, Russia, Britain, you name it. Why would they need this land in Palestine? In fact, since its founding, Israel has been populated with poor Jews, primarily from Eastern Europe, and yet they appear to be pushing an aggressive foreign policy as their borders keep expanding. And of course, there's all the wars the U.S. has waged to destabilize and depopulate the region. And then there's the many well-funded operations undertaken by the intelligence community, one of which is now known as ISIS.
Like 1% within a bank knows the truth of the matter regarding the happenings within the world, which is not surprising, considering they are involved in the flows of money. Those are your clients. You also have governments to deal with, multinationals. You have to deal with secret services, and what they now call terrorist organizations.
That's like the Hebrew words, as I said, Mossad's Institute, and he came up with the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service.
So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
In the ceasefire with ISIS, Senator Paul...
That's not true.
Well,
it's not true.
It's not true.
Whether, I don't care about the report. I know these people intimately. We talk to them all the time.
So many people believe that the goal here is to clear the way for the creation of something called Greater Israel. But for that to happen means a lot of direct conflict between Israelis and Arabs, which is something that at least Orthodox Jews don't seem too interested in, with those communities openly protesting against conscription. Meanwhile, there's an ongoing conflict right at their doorstep with what's left of Palestine. In fact, Kate Rothschild actually did an interview where she explained how Israel was using their control over water to prevent any sort of peace process. You know, it's one of the Mafia's oldest tricks to manufacture a problem and then offer a solution. So here's what I think about the whole situation with Syria. Basically, it seems highly likely that one of the reasons for this conflict is to place Assad in power and give him a sense of legitimacy. For one thing, the guy actually studied in London, the same as a lot of those monarchs down south. I said it once and I'll say it again, the Mafia owns all countries. War is just a part of the so-called grand chessboard where they always play against the people. So let's just be real here. It's not about government and it's not about Assad. It's about genociding and depopulating the region. That and the fear and suffering that comes with it makes the people of a region easier to control. This is a very old trick that they've always used, and it continues to work for them to this day. Now, like I keep saying, there's only one mafia, and that's especially true when it comes to the drug industry. Just look at Freeway Rick Ross, who was a crack kingpin in LA. His drug connections can be linked in multiple ways with American intelligence. And of course, crack cocaine was the big new thing at the time that was just destroying Black America. In fact, many people believe that this whole epidemic was part of an intelligence operation aimed at making American blacks weak politically, with this whole industry also serving as a covert way to fund the Nicaraguan Revolution. And then there's the hippies who were protesting the Vietnam War. The drug most associated with them is lysergic acid dithalmonide, LSD, a drug which American intelligence has used in various experiments prior to the hippie movement. And in the late 50s and 60s, this drug was moved into experiments on college campuses, such as the Stanford Mental Research Institute, effectively introducing the student population to the drug, which led to widespread recreational use. Now, at the center of this new drug culture was a band called the Grateful Dead, and the band's soundman, Owsley Stanley, literally had his own factory to produce LSD, and he was supposedly introduced to the drug through a man named Ken Kesey, who had acid test parties in San Francisco. Now, Kesey had been a former test subject at Stanford University, where he apparently became infatuated with the drug, saying the CIA always has the best stuff.
You can hear the celestial laughter
when you realize it was the CIA that really turned on America.
But I digress. Why did the US, but also Canada, the UK, and finally NATO put boots in Afghanistan? Of course, the media worked to link it all with Al-Qaeda and 9/11, but we've already had a good fireside chat about that. Basically, the country is the world's largest cultivator of opium poppies. Although apparently the Taliban managed to ban production in the areas that they controlled from 2000 to 2002. You know, when the Americans showed up.
Who could do better than we did? We reunified that country that was almost fragmented. Formally, we eradicated the opium cultivation. Afghanistan was producing 75% of all world's drugs.
Of course, opium is the Mafia's fave, and they keep coming up with new products to distribute to the masses. So basically, what appears to have happened in Afghanistan is that the Mafia's hammer came down, and now they micromanage the situation. So where did the Saudis fit in all this? Well, first off, they founded the style of Islam called Wahhabism, which played a part in the Afghan jihad against the Soviets in the 80s. In fact, they would often find themselves aligned with so-called American interests in the region. And one might say they still do, they just kind of flipped the script with the turn of the millennium. Now, if I went any further, I'd just be repeating myself, because after all, it's the same Mafia, so let's go back in time instead. Back in the 1700s, the founder of Wahhabism was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he lived with the Saud family. And they worked together to bring the Arabian Peninsula under one state, based on his No True Scotsman version of Islam. Now, the thing about the House of Saud is that a lot of people theorize that they come from a line of Jews, in particular the Banu Qurayza, or the Jews of Medina. These Jews were in an economically dominant position in northern Arabia until they were supposedly cast out. Of course, historically, that usually meant that a lot of Jews would just stay put and go crypto. Now apparently, according to a translation released by the US Department of Defense, Wahhabism is an attack, or rather I should say an attempted reformation of Islam by the British and the Jews. And according to this report, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab actually descended from a tribe of Jews in Turkey, the same clan that Ataturk, the founder of the modern Turkish state, is believed to have descended from. It also claims that indeed Muhammad bin Saud is of Jewish descent, and furthermore that around the First World War period, the British collaborated with the Wahhabis to destroy the House of Rashid, which at the time posed the greatest threat to the dominance of the House of Saud in the region. So by now, it should come as no surprise that there's a lot of secret societies and clubs, each with their own purpose. For one, let's look at the Round Table Group, which was developed within a secret society named after Cecil Rhodes. So basically, this group was populated by the Rhodes Society's inner circle, to whom the group's true intentions were clear as day. Whereas for the lower levels, these intentions are cloudy or even benign. And not that these guys were even close to the top of the heap either, but their goals seem to be the establishment of a framework for a world government. Their big idea was to set up the Commonwealth of Nations, which comprised the various British colonies. But perhaps more notably, they were involved in taking advantage of the brutality of the First World War to set up the League of Nations. But anyways, after the First World War, the group evolved into what's been called the International Anglophile Network. In Britain, they set up the Royal Institute of International Affairs, aka the Chatham House. And in the US, the Institute of Pacific Relations, or IPR, and the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. Other successors include the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, and the World Economic Forum. And of course, the League of Nations lost all credibility with the advent of the Second World War, so they basically just changed the name, and the United Nations has stuck ever since. There's also the Club of Rome, based out of Switzerland. Now going back to the turn of the century, the Jekyll Island Club was big in the United States. This is where the first legislation was written to create a private Federal Reserve. The notorious Bohemian Club seems to serve a similar function, but that's already been talked to death. Instead, let's look at RAND Corporation, considered by many to be the think tank of the so-called military-industrial complex. They have played a big part in the development of rocket science, war games, and computing, and they're known to do classified work for intelligence and defense agencies. Now, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is a non-profit that concerns itself with group behavior, presumably deconstructing group psychology and coming up with theories that have a practical use. Naturally, these guys have been alleged in many different ways to be involved with social engineering. I'm talking everything from designing bombing runs to induce the most terror, to deciding what kind of music gets to be popular to affect the populace in a certain way. Now, the Mafia also has its own education system in order to induct young prospects and heirs. They get some of the best education and connections money can buy, but there's also things like the Skull and Bones Society at Yale University. This club has welcomed the like of future presidents, media people, and industrialists, such as members of the Rockefeller family. But anyways, this is just a sampling. There's so many more secretive groups than the ones I've listed here. The most important thing to note, like always, is that they all serve important functions for the same Mafia. They're all linked together, and they're all playing 66-dimensional chess against the people. Now, I think this would be a good opportunity to get into some of that juicy occult symbolism. Now, the first thing to understand is something called numerology, which is essentially a language based on numbers that's hidden in plain plain sight. Let's take the 322 of the Skull and Bone Society for example. I'm sure there is in fact multiple meanings that can be taken from this, but 3 times 22 is 66. This is a favorite number for these guys, and if you look for it, you'll see it often in news reports and popular media. Now invert that number and you got 99, which is 9 times 11. 33 is another number to look out for, and one that the Masons seem to have an affinity for. In a nutshell, this is all just the Mafia leaving its mark, and it's associated with things like the Triangle of Enlightenment. Now that's just a brief summary, but if you're interested, Marrow 1 actually has a great video on the topic. But again, always question everything you hear. Next is the planet Saturn, aka Satan, aka Set, aka Kronos, aka Baal. The list goes on, and derivative Saturn symbolism is literally everywhere. For one, there's the black cube of Saturn, which appears as a religious symbol in popular culture and even as erected monuments. Now look at it from a certain angle and you get a hexagon, which has 6 sides and 6 corners, the radii to which are separated by 60-degree angles. And since in numerology you ignore zeros, that leaves you with the number of the beast. Now it might just be a coincidence, considering how could they even see it back then, but Saturn actually has a hexagonal storm on its north pole. Or perhaps it's just NASA playing a little trick on us. There's also something called the square of Saturn, which is this Sudoku-looking grid where every line of 3 numbers adds up to 15. And of course 1 plus 5 is 6, so there you go again. Likely originating from the planet's rings. Another thing indicative of the planet Saturn is the sight, which is related to both a person's time and death, but not the threat of death. I mean, sights actually make horrible weapons, they're just good for the harvest. Now the eye is also possibly derived from the shape of Saturn, but regardless of its inspiration, this kind of eye symbolism goes back at least 3,000 years. Modern day, the consensus seems to be that it represents Lucifer, the bringer of the light, which is probably why it's at the top of the pyramid, because they can only rule by keeping the masses ignorant. This is similar to the G in the Mason symbol, which likely represents their concept of a grand architect of the universe. In other words, an embodiment of the knowledge that they keep to themselves, so the same deal really.
Lucifer matutinus inveniat.
But yeah, Lucifer also brings the light in the sense that he has origins in a god of the rising sun, which is also a reference to Venus, known as the morning star, the concept of which can be traced back as far as the Canaanite god Attar, but also possibly Shahar. In Attar's case, he's also the evening star, which is also Venus, while Shahar has a twin for that role. Now from empire to empire, many of these morning star gods were actually given female personifications. And right up to modern times, you can see symbolism of a woman being the torchbearer of illumination. Now back on the topic of eyes, the Eye of Horus is symbolic of royal power, but it's also the Eye of the Falcon, which could be taken to mean it's all-seeing. This eye is also personified as the snake goddess Wadjet, who is often depicted as protector of the eye of the sun god Ra. Sounds like the morning star to me. There's even a mountain on Venus named after one of her other names. But anyways, as far as the pyramid on the dollar bill, I think the separation between the capstone and the bottom is to show the separation between the mafia in the know and the masses. Just like how the capstones of the pyramids in Egypt were made of a separate and higher quality material. Some even suggest that the Great Pyramid's capstone was made out of solid gold, which would explain why it's never been found. Now aside from that, the mafia also likes to place obelisks on sites of importance to them. Same deal really, but I also think there's some phallic symbolism going on with that. That's not too uncommon with these guys. By the way, you know the Crux Ansata? One of the things it represents is Osiris's magically reconstructed penis. His wife Isis put it together for him posthumously, and then somehow used it to conceive Horus. But yeah, it represents the sun and the power of the priesthood, but there's definitely a much darker side to it as well. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, next is the wings, horns, and double pillars, all of which are believed to be derived from the ring of Saturn. Naturally, this extends to this particular hand sign, and it follows that this is likely a reference to enslavement, but also, as you'll see, ritual sacrifice. Not that it requires an altar or anything like that. For them, war is a ritual. And then there's the owl, which is culturally associated with wisdom. Except as wisdom they want to keep to themselves, and it ties back in with the female Venus symbolism. That's also why they hate those nasty weaving spiders that can think for themselves and put it all together. Remember, any statement that these guys make can have multiple meanings. Next is the so-called Bahamut pose. Well, luckily, they literally spelt it out for us. In Latin, solve, which is pointing to the sun, means separate, and coagula, which is pointing to the moon, means join together. My take on it is that they foster division in the sun, which is associated with sacrifice, whilst they foster unity in the moonlight amongst themselves. I mean, it's just a guess, but it is true that there's a duality where the stronger their order is, the more chaos there is in the world. And on that note, why is it that despite increased awareness of this symbolism in recent years, they actually seem to be using it more? Well, for one, they can delegitimize concerns using controlled dissent and throwing people under the bus. But more importantly, they can see a day where they rule openly just over the horizon, and they're starting to get their gloat on. These people are quite flawed, you know. I mean, I'm sure they pick many impressive agents, but the top guys are really just born into it, merit aside, and with plenty of inbreeding. I mean, some of these family lines I'm gonna show you go way back. And to get a better understanding of what they are today, let's have a closer look into what we know about their history. So there's two major groups involved with all this, the Indo-Europeans and the Semites. The Akkadian Empire was the first major empire reported by historians at over 4,000 years ago. Of course, I've already talked about this empire and how Sargon and the Akkadian people were Semites. Well, the rise and fall of this empire served as both a prototype and the chance for the already powerful money-lending clans to further enrich themselves. But anyways, after the fall, there was many competing empires in the region, including the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Hittites. The Hittite Empire, which occupied roughly the area of modern Turkey, was the first known Indo-European empire in the region. But anyways, you can be guaranteed that these clans I'm talking about were on all sides profiting from wars of conquest. They were behind many thrones and got themselves involved with the priesthood in these very religious societies. They realized that by working together in these secretive groups, they could take control of nations and bleed them dry. They also monopolized on trade. Really, all the stuff you see today, they were already doing back then. In fact, they were probably a lot smarter than the Mafia today, both because of inbreeding and because they had less bullcrap they could hide behind if their schemes fell through. One slip up and the whole impoverished town comes down on you. I mean, maybe people didn't have much choice but to be ignorant back then, but the food was all organic and they weren't adding chemicals to the water. But anyways, the next truly dominant empire, which some historians claim to be the first real empire, was Neo-Assyria. These guys were clearly in the conquering business and they were notorious for their brutality. Wherever they would invade, they would loot, demand tribute, and install their agents to solidify their control. And by they, I do mean the Mafia. These empires built primarily on conquest aren't meant to last, especially with these guys on their back. Meanwhile, based out of Canaan, the Phoenician trade empire was establishing colonies all along the coast of the Mediterranean. Now these guys are believed to be Semites, and it's been claimed that many big-time families today can trace their roots back to them. In fact, in Europe, the notorious Venetian merchants are believed to be their direct descendants. As for their culture, they had adopted staples from surrounding regions, most notably Egypt, and they worshipped a god called Baal who demanded sacrifices. And their main port city, Tyre, was said in myth to be the birthplace of the Greek goddess Europa, who gave the continent its name. They're also known for founding the Carthaginian Empire in modern-day Tunisia. But despite their success, they were still getting bum-blasted and made to pay tribute to their neighbors in the Middle East. And after Neo-Assyria fell, Neo-Babylon, also known as the Chaldean Empire, stepped up to take that role. I should also mention that the use of opium poppy was long since widespread in the region and was first introduced to the Greeks as early as the first millennium BC. And with it, but also due to the fact that the Greeks had adopted their alphabet, we can only assume that the Phonies had spread their influence to that region. But anyways, Neo-Babylon was replaced around 550 BC by the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Also known as the First Persian Empire, these guys were Indo-Iranians, basically cousins to Indo-Europeans. They also brought Zoroastrianism with them, which lended many concepts, including monotheism, to the Jew family religions. They were, however, tolerant of the local polytheistic beliefs. These Persians also attempted to take Greece, but failed. And then the king of Sidon, which was the other major city in Phoenicia, drove the Persians out of his lands using Greek mercenaries sent to him by the pharaoh. But that only served to make the Persians come back down on them 10 times as hard, and they burnt Sidon to the ground. And then Alexander of Macedon happened. He took the throne of Macedon at the age of 20 when his dad Philip II died of mysterious and stabby circumstances. Some think it was due to his mother Olympias wanting her son on the throne. I mean, for that matter, who's to even say that Alexander was really even Philip's son? As a military man, Philip was always away on campaigns. In fact, Olympias would tell the boy, and he even seemed to come to believe that he was the son of Zeus. But in fact, maybe he was something of a god king, because there is a rumor that Olympus cucked Philip with the Egyptian pharaoh that the Persians had removed from power. There's also the matter of the Greek mercenary leader known as Mentor of Rhodes, who had fought both for and against the Persians, including the defense of Sidon. His wife Barsine was said by historians to have later become a mistress to Alexander. That is, after her second marriage with Mentor's brother Memnon ended upon his death. She also happens to be the daughter of Artabazus II, who rebelled against the Persian king. But even with the help of Mentor and Memnon and thousands of Greek mercenaries, his rebellion failed. So him and Memnon actually ended up taking refuge in Macedonia until Mentor convinced the Persians to give them pardon. And when Alexander finally beat Persia, he put Artabazus in charge of Bactria. Now here's a little more symbolism for you. You know the story of the phoenix, how it dies only to rise again? Well, there's an obvious connection here with Phoenicia, which in Greek is pronounced more like Phoenkia. So I think it's more than likely that this bird symbolizes the Mafia's way of doing things. Always lying in wait, hiding behind their puppets, and installing agents near and abroad. And they especially like using female agents, like possibly Olympias. And no matter how many times you put the bird out, it still smolders. By the way, the eagle on the dollar bill was originally meant to be a phoenix. Now upon taking Egypt, Alexander took the title of Pharaoh. And when he died, this title was passed on in name only to his brother, who was feeble-minded, and then to his son, who was assassinated before he grew old enough to rule. This was on orders from the next king of Macedon, Cassandra, who also potentially killed Alexander the Great himself years before with a poison cup. This caused the pharaohship of Egypt, now based in Alexandria, to fall to one of Alexander's former generals. Ptolemy had been close with, and possibly even half-brothers with Alexander the Great, and his Egyptian dynasty extended to the likes of Cleopatra VII, who famously got involved with and bore sons for both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, neither of which managed to become ruler of Rome, and not long after afterwards Egypt became a province of Rome. Still, presumably lots of nobility clans were intermingling at this point. Also, during his conquest, Alexander went to ridiculous lengths to take Tyre. Or to be more specific, New Tyre, which was an island off the coast. He literally had his men fill the sea with crap until they could reach the city's walls by foot. And when they started killing his men from boats, he attacked by sea anyways. Now before we get into Rome, let's talk about Carthage. According to historians, these guys carried on the Phoenician tradition of child sacrifice. They were a military rival to Rome until they were finally crushed in 146 BC. From then on, they too became a province of Rome. The thing to consider though is their descendants, which likely includes the Berbers and possibly Mansa Musa. Now Rome was the next truly big empire. They founded both the city of Venice and the city of London, both of which allegedly became crown corporations, but we'll get into that later. Many of the leaders of Rome were extreme degenerates, such as that absolute treasure Nero, which according to some sources was the one responsible for the Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed much of the city, and that he then built a gigantic palace on top of the ruins that he had to devalue the currency just to pay for. Or Caligula, who apparently forced himself on men's wives and then bragged about it to them while giving them a rating, and openly killed people for personal amusement, such as when he threw a crowd of spectators into a pit of unspecified wild beasts. These are the kind of people that the Mafia did and does allow into positions of power, and like all such empires before it, Rome did eventually start falling apart. The empire split into two, with the Eastern Byzantine Empire lasting much longer, and in the Middle East there was a new Persian empire called the Sassanian, which ended with the rise of Islam and the mass enforcement of the jizya tax, which basically economically inconvenienced people into converting. And if Alberto Rivera was telling the truth, he's dead now by the way, foul play suspected, then the Mafia was still largely in control of the region of the former Roman Empire. You see, Rome never fell, it just rearranged into a more ideological construct, one that he called the Whore of Babylon. The funny thing is, the spear tip of the Mafia is often female. Attractive female agents are great for infiltrating and exerting influence on new empires. But yeah, Western Rome was devastated first by the Goths and then the Huns. Then of course we have the Khazars. I've already said about all I have on them, except they also brought their neighbors, the Bulgars. Also, they have steppe people ancestors that tried and failed to invade China, and between then and Khazaria, they broke off with the people that would become the Mongol hordes. Later on, the Great Khan would ban halal, kosher, and circumcision in his empire. Meanwhile, Charlemagne set up the Frankish Empire, the first real Western European empire since the fall of Rome, and it was Catholic. And by 962, we had the first official Holy Roman Empire, with the first official Holy Roman Emperor being Otto I. Although the HRE was often called the Patchwork Empire for obvious reasons, it was really just the center of influence for the Vatican, whose influence extended far beyond its borders and was always pushing. The Mafia would subvert, oppress, and in some cases even create new ideologies to exert influence in far-flung regions. A more recent example of this is communism, but you can tell that they had a lot of practice by then. Now there was still a great deal of interest in Old Phoenicia, or modern-day Lebanon. The HRE would set up the Crusader states and do war with their frenemies, the Muslims, bringing back with them a great deal of wealth. By the way, did anyone tell you about that time they sent 30,000 children or so, led by a 12-year-old boy? They just kinda disappeared, and the Venetians who had sent them shrugged while counting their money. Real talk, there was so much pedo stuff going on. If you dig into any era with the Mafia, you start finding it. Now, eventually the Byzantines gave way to the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Basically, they were the yin to the HRE's other yin. Also, they were a multicultural empire, just like old Rome and much of Southern Europe. That's why you see so many mixed traits with them, just like with these so-called Jews. And for that matter, Eastern European women seem to catch the highest price at the slave markets in the Middle East. Now, there was actually a sort of dispute for who was the true successor to Rome between East and West. In the West, of course, you had the HRE, but in the East, the Byzantines, in particular Constantinople, was sometimes referred to as Second Rome. And later on, Russia, in particular Moscow, was sometimes called Third Rome. But that was disputed with the Germanics, the Italians, and the Ottomans. In the case of the Nazis, the Third Reich seemed to be specifically the Third Holy Roman Empire. While at the same time, one of the principles of Italian fascism was that they were the rightful heirs to the original Roman Empire, with the famous book Doctrine of Fascism being allegedly ghostwritten by Giovanni Gentile. Now in the 16th and 17th centuries there was the Protestant Reformation, and in the 18th the Age of Enlightenment began. Protestants being basically Christians who protested the Catholic monopoly. Aside from violent oppression, they were dealt with using controlled dissent agents. Aside from that, many Protestant Christian movements continued but under Jesuit control. And as far as the Age of Enlightenment, basically, just like today, people were getting a little too woke. The Jesuits were getting way too much attention, to the point where they disbanded right before the French Revolution, which of course was the Mafia's creation. What they did was pin the blame for people suffering on the monarchies. Then they gave a face to this movement and let Napoleon rampage all over Europe. He even made a grab for the Holy Land. But around the time that was all over and done with, the Jesuits came back. Napoleon, like those who came after him, talked of a new order, but it was really a lot like the old order. Except now, much of Europe had to rebuild and start over. It also meant the beginning of the Rothschild banking empire, which brings us into the modern era. Now let's talk a little more about the Jesuits. So based on everything we've seen so far, I think it's fair to guess that the Jesuits are primarily a military intelligence agency. No different and not at all opposed to those of various nations. As a matter of fact, and despite being compartmentalized, you might even say it's all the same organization. In fact, many believe that the Jesuits are the ones handing orders down from the top. Actually, we can get a pretty good idea of what the Mafia's standard command structure looks like because they made the mistake of revealing that of the Chinese triads. But the Jesuits are really just a continuation. Before them it was the Dominicans. The Jesuit order is actually believed to have been created as a direct reaction to the Protestant Reformation. In other words, a way to put down any threats to their monopoly on religion. Now let's look a bit at Jesuit activities in China. It's interesting to note that of all countries, the Pope never seems to visit the leadership of the state. In fact, they have a long history of attempted Jesuit infiltration. Back in the late 16th century in Portuguese Macau, there was Alessandro Valignano. Realizing that they wouldn't get very far without a proper understanding of the language and culture, he established the St. Paul Jesuit College of Macau, a school which claims to be the first Western university in East Asia. Before him, there was Francis Xavier, who was totally determined to break into the country, which at the time was closed to foreigners. He ended up traveling to Sichuan Island off the coast while trying to secure entrance to the mainland. But in the end, he died of a fever, never stepping foot in the Middle Kingdom. Shortly afterwards, the Portuguese leased the port city of Macau, which allowed them a way in. And another big Jesuit name from that era was Mateo Ricci. He was named Superior General of the China Mission and even reportedly managed to convert several Chinese officials to Catholicism. His primary job still appeared to be intelligence work, however, to pave the road for future generations. Shortly after his death, the Ming Dynasty fell and was replaced with the Qing, which caused countless Chinese officials and intellectuals to commit mass suicide in defiance of serving foreign rulers. Now, the Jesuits were also heavily involved in the colonizing of the Americas, which, of course, necessitated a certain level of genocide. Let's look at Belgian Jesuit priest Pierre-Jean de Smet, who lived in the 1800s. He is said to have infiltrated the Iroquois people and distributed to them disease-carrying black robes. So it's obvious enough that the Jesuits have a big amount of pull in world events. But who's in charge of them? Well, I've already mentioned the Black Pope, the Superior General, and he very likely has power that supersedes that of the White Pope. I mean, in the end of the day, public figureheads are not much different than actors, whilst the real shot callers don't need the attention. Now, connected to and surrounding the Vatican are the papal nobility families. These families, along with the other so-called black nobility families, are said to have deep roots in the power structures of ancient Rome and even previous empires. Like with the popes, there's also the white nobility families, which includes all families placed in the public eye. Among these black nobility families, the most powerful are said to be the Samaglias, the Farneses, the Aldobrandinis, the Breakspears, and the Orsinis. David Rothschild, by the way, is known to have married Princess Olympia Aldobrandini. The question is, which one of them felt like they were marrying up? Now get this, they say there's in fact a third pope, the Grey Pope, of the Orsini clan, also known as Orso or Maximus. His name, Pepe Orsini. I can't by any means confirm this though. It's always better to do the research and judge for yourself, and this goes for anything that I say or anyone else. Speaking of which, Johnny Gat, Maribel 1, and Really Graceful, check them out. But yeah, as I already established, these guys are big into symbolism, so there might be more to this internet froggy meme than meets the eye. And then there's Henry Breakspear, who's also hard to find good information on. He is said to be living in Macau, the old Jesuit base camp for China. And Macau is definitely a place worth looking into. But anyways, all of these families are said to control the various knightly orders. Notably the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta, and the Knights of Columbus that are still very much active today. Although I'm not too sure about the Teutons, but the Nazis sure like to take up their symbolism. Now to support this theory, let me give you a few examples of active knights in today's world. Basically, all important Bush family members are said to be Knights of Malta, and George Bush Jr. is known to be a Knight of the Bath. These alleged Malta Bushes includes Prescott Bush, who many say was one of the American Nazi collaborators. Between his son and grandson, they were the figureheads to another crusade in the Middle East. Jeb Bush is known to be a 4th degree Knight of Malta. And as I said, public politics are just for show, so he did have his role to play as a bowling pin wearing an old hat. The Bush family is said to trace its roots back to the powerful Pierce or Percy family of England. And really, a lot of these families' power is portrayed as a thing of the past, but who would just give it up? Like, is there something about the modern era that forced them to graciously step down? If that thing is public awareness, then it makes more sense that they just stepped into the shadows. Now let's look at Donald Trump. According to Wiki, Trump's foreign policy advisor, at least during his campaign, was Joseph E. Smits, a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, who's been involved with the Department of Defense and Blackwater. The island of Malta, by the way, was first colonized by the Phoenicians, and the Order of Malta was originally called the Knights Hospitaller, established during the Crusades around the year 1099. The Knights of Malta also have observer status at the UN. Also, the man referred to as the father of American intelligence, William J. Donovan, was a Knight of Malta. Now back on Trump, his deputy assistant, Sebastian Gorka, is a member of the Hungarian Order of Vitez, a knightly order said to have been under the command of the Nazis during the Second World War. As for Trump himself, some people have said that he's a Knight of Malta, but nothing too solid. He did, however, spend 2 years at the Jesuit Fordham University. Afterwards, he transferred transferred to the University of Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is quite revealing to look into who funds various schools. And one major funder of the University of Pennsylvania is the Annenberg Foundation, headed by Walter H. Annenberg, a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great. But yeah, with all this black nobility stuff in mind, what does that make of the Roths? Well, it is true that they are involved with the papal state finances, along with the Torlonia family, but it's also true that they get quite a bit of publicity, and for that matter, let's look into their name, which is German for Red Shield, a name which was chosen intentionally, as the family's original last name was Bauer. Well, in the old Empire of Rome, the Red Shield was the symbol of the common foot soldier who went out and did the empire's dirty work, whilst incurring all the risks of being on the front line, so basically pawns.
Erland Rothschild, of course, he's a sir, so you have to call him sir. He's a big deal. He's also a gazillionaire, billionaire, very successful. I think everyone knows you were supporting Hillary Clinton. You liked her.
No,
right?
with that.
In fact, red is the color of Rome, and a lot of these big family names starting with Roth quite possibly just oats them as simple court Jews. Also note the various groups like the Cardinals and the Knights of Malta who wear red. And a red cape or capa rubea is reserved only for popes and said to be a symbol of imperialism and martyrdom. Except when it comes to that second thing, they have people for that. So obviously, I think it's important to map out where the Mafia's power is concentrated today geographically. First, let's look at Italy, where of course we have the Vatican. The Italian House of Savoy stepped down after World War II after accusations of colluding with the fascists. But before that, they've been known as a real powerhouse for almost 1,000 years. So after the war, they actually kicked them out and barred male heirs from re-entering the country until 2002, giving up the official monarchy to have a republic-style government. Make of that what you will, but let's look at one of their recent prime ministers, Silvio Berlusconi. This guy clearly has a real bromance with Putin, and allegedly one time took the man on a tour of Europe to sign long-term oil and gas contracts and make use of Russia's surpluses. And all the song and dance aside, Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas to European countries. Basically, Russia is being used as a source of fossil fuels, and this former Italian prime minister quite possibly had a role in orchestrating it. And this, along with history, would seem to suggest that Russia is a vassal or slave state, and Italy is a master state. To back this up, Russia's been hit with many sanctions to make sure that they never get too wealthy. Now let's look at Spain and Portugal, both master colonizers, especially when it comes to Central and South America. So here's a good question. Who was Christopher Columbus really? Actually, it's been revealed recently that he was likely the son of a Polish king. But they already knew about America though. I mean, the Vikings had been there, and there's even some evidence to suggest that the Phoenicians knew about the continent. They also had a pretty good idea of the dimensions of planet Earth owing to experiments as far back as ancient Greece. Remember what I said about the eye? The Mafia keeps knowledge to themselves as a form of control. As a matter of fact, many supposedly burned books have likely actually been taken to the Vatican vaults. But anyways, his reasons for going were simple enough: to convert or kill the locals and to extract the wealth to master countries in Europe. And by the way, here's a little side note for you. Fidel Castro went to Jesuit schools, and his father was a Spanish migrant. And judging by his connections and the state of Cuba underneath him, he was running a colonial-style slave state. It's possible he descended from the House of Castro, which is alleged to be connected with the powerful House of Farnese. Now, if we look at more recent history, Spain has had quite a bit of privilege. When Hitler was rolling over Europe to form the Third Reich, he didn't dare to enter Spain. A few years prior, and along with the Spanish Legion, the Nazis had assisted in the Spanish Civil War in installing a dictatorship under General Franco. And they were basically allied with the Nazis during World War II, providing support but not getting heavily militarily involved, possibly to spare Spain of the same hatred that was directed towards the Germans after the war. Now, the dictator, Francisco Franco, actually worked to re-establish the official monarchy in Spain, and upon his death in 75, Juan Carlos took over as king. And in 2014, he stepped down to hand the title to his son, Felipe VI. Now, if you want an example of modern-day Spanish privilege, they literally have no government. Well, to be more specific, they basically gridlock the king's representative government, and no one's in too much of a rush to fix it. Really, governments aren't necessary. They're just another avenue for the Mafia to steal from and control the people. And according to polls in Spain, they're enjoying their life without one. I mean, if you want certain services, that can easily be handled by a company, and it should always be optional, because being forced to pay under threat is extortion. It's really as simple as that. And actually, another example of a country doing well without a government is Somalia, except they aren't in the same position of privilege with the Mafia, so they went ahead and destabilized them. You know, to make them suffer until they submit to being ruled over once again. Now, I think that a big reason why Spain gets so much privilege is because they're a physical buffer state between Africa and the heartland of Europe, along with Morocco to the south, that is. And by heartland, I basically mean the territories of the old Holy Roman Empire. Territories such as modern-day Poland, where they have a strong Catholic movement to reject the mostly Muslim mass immigration. Poland also happens to receive the most financial support out of any European country by the EU. But the real fortress country has gotta be Switzerland. I mean, it's literally a mountain fortress. In fact, the House of Habsburg, the longtime seat of the Holy Holy Roman Emperor was named after a fortress built in Switzerland. In the 16th century, the Habs split between two main family lines, one in Austria and the other in Spain. Oddly enough, it was an Austrian Habsburg that was emperor of the Second Mexican Empire. You see, the thing is, the main line of Habsburgs in Spain literally inbred themselves to death. But in Austria, you still got the Habsburg-Lorraine family going strong. Of course, they no longer have the official power of the Holy Roman Emperor in modern times. The thing is, though, even the Holy Roman Emperor appears to have been answerable to the Pope, as evidenced by the humiliation at Genoa. But yeah, the current head of the Habsburgs, Karl von Habsburg, is president of the Austrian branch of the Pan-European Union. Him and his family were actually banned from the country of Austria, but then they were allowed back in because of so-called human rights. Now, Switzerland has lots of connections with Germany and Austria, you know, that area, with the majority of Swiss people being considered Germanic. I mean, if we look at World War II, they stick out like a sore thumb for not being taken over, and it was basically the BIS based in Switzerland that kept the whole war running smoothly. It's also, as I said, a fortress, and one of the many bases with natural defenses that the Mafia can run to. Places like this include the island of Iceland, where they've been given the privilege of being freed from private central banking. New Zealand is another one, where many foreigners have bought large plots of land to build compounds. That country has been given the privilege of not having to pay land taxes. There's also smaller islands that serve this purpose as well, such as the island of Malta, where again, there's no land tax. And I mean, just in general, wherever you see the Mafia permitting people privileges, you should know that something's up. And some of the highest taxes are in Nordic countries, so you should know something's down. Also, you're not fooling me, Croatia. Now let's look at Greece, the so-called birthplace of Western civilization. Well, the Greeks officially abolished the House of Glucksburg as their monarchy in 1974. This house and its parent, the House of Oldenburg, ruled over Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and many of the northern German states. So essentially, after Greece was freed from Ottoman rule, they were placed back under the thumb of the Holy Roman Empire. So anyways, Greece is right next to Turkey, and today they're acting like something of a gateway for migrants. But if you could put a face on the European migrant crisis, it would have to be the German Chancellor, known as Mother Merkel, although she is childless. Of course, as a politician, she's not much more than a face, and she might be Hitler's daughter, maybe. So what about the UK, with the Queen and the most colonies and all that? Well, basically, as I've explained earlier, their royalty is straight out of Germania, and Anglo-Saxon refers to both the Anglo people and the Saxons, both of whom were Germanic. Now, aside from the Queen, there's an arguably more important crown in England that refers to the City of London, or to be more accurate, the City of London Corporation, which is contained within the City of London. It's one of the big three, although I'm not sure that it being a financial center is as relevant as it once was. Anyways, the Crown is where the British East India Company was based out of. For that matter, who is really running these British colonies? More often referred to as Crown colonies, which means it suspiciously could be taken either way. But let's go back to 1302 and look at the papal bull Unum Sanctum. A papal bull, by the way, is something of a declaration from the Pope, and this one basically declared that the temporal authorities should be subservient to the spiritual authorities. In other words, them, and one could extrapolate that this means that everything owned is ultimately owned by them. And then there's Romanus Pontifex, which entitled the Crown of Portugal to all lands south of Cape Borchador in Africa, and had the effect of conveying the right of use of real property under the control of the Roman Pontiff. This has been presumed based on Unum Sanctum, said to be the first expressed trust in history. It also reaffirmed that Saracens, Africans, and pagans in general could be reduced to slavery, which offered an easy solution to the fact that these new lands were already occupied. Next is Eterni Regis, or the Eternal Crowns. On the face of it, this papal bull was to broker peace between the kingdoms of Castile and Portugal over territorial disputes. Without this conflict, this would allow both, but Portugal in particular, to grow its empire much quicker. It also allowed Christopher Columbus the legal basis to act as vice-regal agent in the Americas. This papal bull is said to have created something called the Crown of Aragon, worn by the highest steward of all Roman subjects of the Roman Pontiff, and that it was the Crown of Spain until in 1604 it was granted to King James I of England, although it went back to Juan Carlos in 1975. Now the last papal bull we'll be looking at is the Bull of Convocation, created in 1537. This bull is said to have created the crown of the ecclesiastical see, and that it was acclaimed to all the souls that were lost at sea. Furthermore, that this crown was granted to Henry VIII of England in 1540, which, if this is true, grants him the authority to literally reap people's souls. Okay, maybe not literally. It's more like their souls are subjugated and made to obey admiralty law because they exist in the Holy See. It's similar to being granted citizenship, and that's one whole can of worms right there. These are only people's interpretations though, which is fair game because the truth is often hidden within language. Anyways, just like the City of London, the Vatican is ultimately a corporation. It's a company basically, with both being presumably run by members of the black nobility through their proxies, such as the Jesuits or the so-called European Jews. Jews were often used as a sort of shield between the nobility and the common people, often taking up lucrative but animosity-generating tasks such as tax collection and usury. They also dealt in valuable metals and goods, as well as the drug and slave trades, which we saw a lot of when it comes to the activities of the crown. But actually, another group to consider is the Temple Bar, B-A-R, which sounds an awful lot like Templar. In fact, there is an old Knights Templar church built in the City of London in the late 12th century. The thing is though, at the time the Templars as proto-international bankers were getting too powerful for the Vatican's liking, and although it's claimed otherwise, it's pretty widely believed that they teamed up with the King of France in 1307 to prosecute many of them as heretics. And it stands to reason that from then on, like in the case with Switzerland, the Templars were brought under the control of the Vatican as agents, and thus they were the go-between for the financial center that was the City of London. Note that the round-style construction of the BIS and the Vatican Bank is very similar to that of the Temple Church. It's one of the Templar signature styles of architecture. Now let's look at the Queen, in particular her coronation, which is just drenched in symbolism. First of all, it took place on the top of a step pyramid. A lot of Egyptian stuff here actually. Some people think that those 3 ropes sticking out of her arm actually symbolize a traditional flail. And the tradition of a monarch holding the royal scepter goes back at least as far as the staff of Amun-Ra. And within it you see the Great Star of Africa, cut from the largest diamond ever found. The orb with the cross, of course, represents dominion over the globe, the Queen herself being the supreme governor over the Church of England. Now according to one source, her royal lineage can be traced all the way back to Abraham. It's that many historians believe that that's actually a reference to the pharaoh Amenemhat I. Now there is a rumor that the United Kingdom is a reference to the reunion of the 12 tribes of Israel, with the English royal family descending through the tribe of Dan via the Vikings, aka the Danes, but I am only talking about royal families here. Also the tribe of Dan is associated with the serpent. But anyways, I do think that the UK represents a mafia stronghold, but it's the Queen, not the King, you know what I mean? Although technically it's their proxy Uncle Sam who's been acting as the Queen for quite a while now. And some people have claimed that it's really the Breakspear family that's in charge of the monarchy, so that's worth looking into. But then what does one make of the rumor that the head of the Breakspears is now in Macau? But enough with the rumors, although that is something that you're kind of forced to sort through at this level. I mean, unlike the little court Jews, the real mafia heads actually put some effort into covering their tracks. I mean, many of these families, despite their existence being confirmed, don't even have wiki pages. But hey, once again, don't just take my word for it, do the research and fact check me. Constant investigation and spreading the truth, guys, that's what it's all about. Also, the Queen's husband, known as the Duke of Edinburgh, is related to Vlad the Impaler, aka Dracula. And on that note, I'll take this chance to talk about the blood drinking stuff. The Mafia, including the royals, has a lot of issues from inbreeding, including many blood diseases. In a nutshell, they have very unhealthy blood and would benefit greatly from transfusions of blood from a young healthy person of the same blood type. Blood cells of course die and need replacement, so it would have to be a regular thing as well. Nowadays, people are waking up to the fact that there's a lot of pedos in the Mafia, and if you study the history, there always has been. And if we look at satanic ritual abuse, which is a very real thing by the way, they prefer young victims, often children, who they sexually, physically, and mentally abuse. And often they drink the victim's blood, which gives them a sense of euphoria because it's full of adrenaline. Of course, it often ends in child sacrifices, and that ritual goes way back. So it's possible that blood drinking has deep roots in Mafia rituals as well, especially since it's the next best thing to transfusions. Now before we finish rounding it down to the current heartland of the Mafia, let's talk about Vietnam for no particular reason. With everything I've already talked about, it doesn't take much to see that this country is clearly a vassal state. A vassal state which not too long ago made up much of the official colony of French Indochina. And then there was this Ho Chi Minh guy, who like many communist leaders spent some time in New York doing, to paraphrase, nothing much. During World War II, he led a US-backed coalition against Japanese occupation. And then he led the First Indochina War to kick out the Frenchies, backed by the two big communist ideology nations. The result of that being the country divided and Ho Chi Minh's forces taking control of the north. In 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem was elected president of South Vietnam. He was a Catholic and is said to have been backed by the Black Pope of that time, Jean-Baptiste Jansen. He's also said to have been the protege of the 6th Archbishop of New York, Francis Joseph Spellman. Clearly Diem was really pushy and intolerant with his Catholicism because there was constant Buddhist protests. He wouldn't back down with his ideology and he was getting a lot of bad PR because of it. So allegedly, this caused American intelligence to give the green light to have him assassinated. Shortly afterwards was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was less of a false flag and more of an insult to the American people's intelligence. American boots were already on ground, but they started really ramping it up in 1965. They literally dropped more bombs on Vietnam than had been dropped in the entirety of World War II. Now one thing to understand is that there was a lot of opium being grown in this former French colony, and the Mafia likes to use drug proceeds to fund various black operations. Allegedly, the Jesuits had failed to establish better control of the region, so they called in the heavies. The whole thing was of course being controlled by the Mafia on both sides, all to abuse the people until they would accept being ruled over and used once again. One of the well-known results of this is that Vietnam became a popular destination for foreign sex tourists. But also, opium production continued in the more obscure mountainous regions, and it set an example for the Golden Triangle of Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. Long story short, the Vietnamese people will never be allowed to prosper under the Mafia. Now this is just a theory, but there has been such a thing as a tsunami bomb project. The official story is that it was never tested on a full scale, much less with nukes. However, underwater tests with nukes have been tried, fracturing the earth and causing major landslides. So all I'm saying is that it's possible. Now let's talk for just a minute about Malcolm X. Malcolm was a member of the Nation of Islam until he left in 1964. Unlike the civil rights movement, the Nation, run by Elijah Muhammad, was for the separation of whites and blacks, but more importantly, made a lot of thinly veiled calls for a violent uprising against so-called white supremacy, which was really just the observation of privilege being given to the people of the Mafia's European master states. So it's like Hitler basically, directing people's discontentment and hatred onto a broad group instead of investigating and spreading the truth. They also happen to be connected with the Black Dragon Society, which again was an Asian ultranationalist group, which offered financial support to people such as Sun Yat-sen. And a prominent member of the mostly Japanese Black Dragon Society, Sato Kada Takahashi, was offering financial and possibly military backing to the Nation of Islam. So basically, what I'm saying is that the Nation of Islam was most likely already infiltrated or not even grassroots in the first place. But after actually visiting Mecca, Malcolm realized that he was basically being used as an agitator, so he converted to Sunni and did his own thing. Although I'm not a big fan of ideologies, he thought that whites and blacks could work together within a Muslim framework, and the Mafia just hates it when people get along. So basically, he did a 360 and walked away from the Nation of Islam, because now he really had to watch his back. The man who would later assume the leadership of the nation, Louis Farrakhan, apparently even said that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off, and eventually in 1965 they turned him into Swiss cheese. Now Malcolm's daughter, Kabbalah Shabazz, allegedly later tried to hire a hit on Farrakhan, both for revenge and to protect her mother, who had apparently spoken out about Farrakhan calling the hit on Malcolm, all according to alleged former FBI informant Michael Fitzpatrick, who was paid to pose as the assassin for hire. The question is, if American intelligence was so clued into what was going on, why didn't they try to arrest Farrakhan? The truth is, intelligence agencies always move to manipulate different movements from behind the scenes. If you want to know more about this in regards to blacks in America, look up COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party. But anyways, back on topic. Where is the Mafia's power most concentrated? So if you look at the old Holy Roman Empire, it makes up roughly the main Germanic lands, plus Italy, although the title of Holy Roman Emperor has been held by the Habsburg branch living in Spain. Now if you look at Germany today, they have the privilege of unfluoridated drinking water, which to be fair is not unheard of in the rest of Europe. A lot of the real science experiments in Western countries actually occur in the North American vassal states, like GMOs, the cultivation of which Germany has opted out of. And by the way, the fattened meat, especially non-grass-fed meat, goes bad and becomes toxic within just a few days of butchering. So don't trust the best before meme. You should always try to eat freshly killed meat, although you do have some leeway when it comes to very low fat cuts. Also, bringing water to a boil and letting it sit for a while in open air can help remove the gut-destroying chlorine content. But on the topic of the USA, it was Germanic people who populated the country while it rose to power. They received many benefits, even getting a break from debt slavery in the early days. Also, in Canada, the province of Alberta has a high concentration of Germanics, and there just happens to be a lot of money there also. And get this, while other provinces have a lot of problems with rats, Alberta has been basically rat-free for 50 years. Speaking of which, if we actually really look at who runs the Federal Reserve, you'll see a lot of Anglo-Saxons, such as the current president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, William C. Dudley. You can't say the same thing about, for example, Spaniards, but for that matter, what even really is a Spaniard?
I'm Spanish?
Basically, the Germanic Visigoths had conquered Spain in the 5th century, and held and presumably settled the land for about 300 years until the Moors took over, but they were eventually pushed out by the Christian armies. So basically, modern Spanish people are most likely predominantly Germanic Moorish mixes, so they do get some privilege, because while white privilege doesn't actually exist, Germanic privilege does. And by the way, Mein Kampf was allegedly ghostwritten by a Jesuit priest named Bernhard Stanfel. But yeah, to further back this claim up, according to Wiki's page on crime in Germany, there's no such thing as a German mafia. It's all just foreign mafias and hooligans. You see, it's a privilege to not have your people associated with criminality in the media. Like seriously, look up the German mafia in your favorite search engine. Like nothing, just some video game stuff, some bikers, and blaming everything on the Italians and the Arabs. And by the way, German laws have recently become more supportive of medical weed, which statistically means a loss in sales for big pharma when it comes to things like pain meds and anxiety medication. Another privilege that the Germans enjoy is something called the Mittelstand, which is basically a strong and sometimes government-backed culture of small businesses. And then there's a lot of often family-run businesses that are huge players in their industries, such as Miele or Trumpf. Another thing to consider is innovation, which Germany is known for. For that, let's look at the patent offices. One such office Albert Einstein spent some time at as a clerk. The thing about these patent offices is that whoever controls them has a monopoly on so-called intellectual property. They can steal your ideas or just shut them down, and obviously the mafia takes a great interest in such things. If you want an example of that, look into how Nikola Tesla was dealt with. But yeah, a lot of these German innovations could have easily been taken from elsewhere. A lot like how the United States States brain-drained China and India for decades. So now, what about China's One Belt, One Road initiative? Well, as it turns out, it's not really about exporting surplus commodities such as coal and steel. Apparently, they actually have the intentions to export industry and invest in foreign infrastructure. So basically, the Mafia-controlled Chinese people involved get influence outside of China. But in exchange, they have to build free infrastructure and export technology, with the sea path leading to Venice and the land path leading to Germany and Spain. It's a pretty raw deal though. For one thing, mining causes a lot of pollution. That's why it's usually relegated to vassal states. Another thing is that many poor countries along the way might feel that they are being exploited, and China will get the backlash. And in the long run, it doesn't benefit the Chinese people at large. Just a handful who gain some influence in Europe and elsewhere. And also, in addition to Germany and Spain, Iran is one of the current major stops. In fact, I do think that Iran is one of the major countries for the Mafia. For one thing, their people are basically cousins to Indo-Europeans, which encompasses Germanics. Another thing is lion symbolism, which they share with European nobility, but is not all that common elsewhere. In actuality, I think there's a lot of important states in the Mafia in the Middle East and surrounding regions. Obviously, there's Israel and the Saudis, but also Lebanon and Egypt have been left largely untouched, with many of these places being tax havens, similar to the European stronghold states. And although I wouldn't necessarily call them master states, it does seem like there's a lot of fairly high-up members of the Mafia in the region. I mean, it only makes sense given that that area is where the Mafia has spent most of its history. You just have to look at which countries are getting punished and which aren't. Not all Arabs are victims. In fact, the Mafia is not tied to nations or ethnicities. Case in point, Germanic privilege isn't going to last much longer. Currently, some of these high-up families are already starting to mix with blacks. You see, whites are waking up too much. That's why we have all these white nationalist shills, to keep it contained. That's also why they're importing so many African and Middle Eastern migrants. The Vatican also seems to be inducting many new African members. So basically, these mass immigrants that they're allowing in are to empower them, with many of them being trained as agents. And in fact, I wouldn't even be too surprised if some of the top guys in the Mafia were black. This is a process that they've gone through several times before between empires. It's just the phoenix at it again. And the rising power right now isn't China, and it isn't Israel, it's Rome. But for them to pull it off without complete chaos beyond even their control, it's a fairly slow process. So let's talk a little bit about buffer state privilege. So as I said, there's certain countries that act as a buffer between Africa and Europe, and they get special privileges because of it. Of course, you've got Spain in the west, but in the east, it's possible this is the main reason for Israel's existence. But there's also Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Turkey. I mean, if these countries were to fall, Europe would be flooded with Africans. It would make the migrant crisis look like a joke. I mean, just look up what happened to the whites in Rhodesia and now South Africa. And add to that most of Africa has suffered because of the Mafia. I doubt they're gonna make any distinctions when it comes to Europeans. If these countries were to fall, literally hordes of Africans would flood into Europe. The black nobility would become the black nobility. And this will definitely happen in the case of a war. But also this means that all these countries are in a special position with the Mafia. Meaning that despite being vassal states, they can acquire privileges such as Spain has. And they absolutely should, starting with maybe Turkey or Egypt, seeing as they exist at either end of the buffer. This also includes certain North African nations such as Morocco and Algeria. Demand that the Mafia stops robbing you with government, among other things. Encourage everyone around you not to vote, not to play along with this nonsense, and to inform others. Well, that pretty much goes for everyone, but at first, these buffer zones have the best chance of attaining these privileges. So as far as I can tell, these countries include in the west, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, and France kinda. You see, France is a vassal state to Germany, but they get treated badly because they don't commit to fighting wars for them. In fact, that's one of the reasons they're bringing in so many low inhibition migrants in the first place. They need people who will fight. But also, a big reason why migrants are being sent to Spain is probably to cause chaos and re-legitimize the government over there. In the end, it's all just the Mafia buying time. And it's pretty funny in a way that whites would need blacks to protect them from their own people. But an easy way to counter this would be for the local white people to simply explain to them what exactly is going on. They don't currently understand these issues as well as white people do, and currently they're being used as pawns in these divide and conquer tactics. These migrants all seem to be arriving with fresh clothing too, and surviving in these countries with no money. So clearly they are getting a lot of support. I could get into the NGOs and all that, but basically it's all under the Mafia's control. But again, they know that these buffer states' cooperation is the only thing keeping it under control. By the way, you know Macaroons? He's literally a co-prince of the co-principality of Andorra. The other co-prince being this Catholic bishop. Now the eastern buffer countries include Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and then there's Russia and Ukraine covering the long route in the northeast. People in these countries need to realize the special status that they have and take full advantage of it before the Mafia figures out a way to shut them down. So time is of the essence, but when these privileges start catching on and spreading, there's nothing they can do to stop it. When everyone starts to see that we're better off without them and that it can be done, it'll spread like a virus. This includes, of course, Germanic people who get robbed just like everyone else but make up the bulk of the US military. The same people who in Germany were robbed blind prior to World War II, and then they blamed it on a made-up race. So they marched across Europe, liquidating and destroying, only to end up destitute once again. And now you've got all these white nationalist shills directing discontent at the Juden once again. Not that all Jews are innocent by any means. There's many Jews occupying prominent positions with the Mafia, and it's easy to point the finger. But But they're not at the top. In fact, they're basically human shields. And more often than not, it's not even them but normal Jews that people's hatred becomes focused on. In reality, we'd all be much better off without the Mafia, and it's just gonna get much worse with them. Another thing is taxes. If everyone refuses to pay them, what legitimacy do they have? With the system in place as it has been for a long time now, whatever achievements you may make, they can and do take it away from you by force. And they can and do destroy and rob entire countries with forced wars. And by the way, just a reminder, remember to fact check everything that I say here. It's better to know than to believe. Now before I give you some more actionable ideas, let's really get an understanding of the many different ways that they're robbing us. So they're pretty much trolling us with carbon taxes. I mean, regardless of what impact humans actually have on climate change, but if you're curious, my opinion is not very much. But they're literally taxing people just for using technology that they don't realistically have any choice in. The same technology that could have largely been replaced decades ago if they had only allowed it. And since the modern world still runs on fossil fuels, that means literally everything becomes more expensive. It's not a solution, it's literally highway robbery. But if they want to troll us with this, we can troll them back. For one thing, religious institutions, in particular churches, don't pay taxes in most places. Heck, in some places they even get government assistance. So if literal carbon can be taxed, why not religion? Another thing that should be taxed big time is war. I mean, just look at America's military budget. They spend over $1 million for every citizen. Government jobs should be taxed big time too, and the IRS, and the banks, and especially the prison system. In fact, all state-run businesses could do with much higher taxes. And then make sure all that tax money goes to social services like schools, welfare, and pensions. Anything that helps us out, because the money's either with them or it's with us. Basically, citizens should figure out a new social service that allows them to suck money out of the Mafia on their own terms, rather than on the terms of the government, who serves the Mafia and ultimately robs you blind anyways. Another thing that no one seems to talk about is wars, which the Mafia coordinates from both sides and leaves entire populations with nothing, resetting everyone's progress so they can never get ahead. Another good example is what they've done to farming. In the EU, they often push small farms out over convoluted arguments about efficiency. In reality, big corporate farms are not all that efficient, and they generally produce a lower quality product. Speaking of which, GMOs are such cancer, and I feel bad saying that because I feel like I could get cancer at any time. But I digress. The real problem for farmers when it comes to GMOs is that they're trademarked. In other words, putting the world on GMO food puts food production under their control, and it makes it that much easier for them to put small farmers out of business and put entire countries in a debt to them. Just look up how the World Bank and IMF makes use of GMOs. And while you're at it, look up the food production cartels, which are allegedly under the control of the crown. Now here's another thing about food. You ever see the circled U on your food product? Well, it stands for Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations in America, and the K, it means kosher. Both certifications are basically a hidden tax in the name of the chosen ones. Another thing I've already talked about are the patent offices, where they can shut down and steal people's ideas. Well, they can also create completely unfair monopolies using intellectual property laws. The World Intellectual Property Organization, by the way, is based in Geneva, Switzerland. And for some reason, Palestine of all places has permanent observer status. Like, what's going on with that? It's possible Palestine has a real role to play in all this as well. Another thing that's putting us in the poorhouse is the mortgage scheme. I mean, in the end of the day, it's just a loan. And you know what I said about loans. If your situation changes and suddenly you can't pay, the bank or broker can and often does take the money you paid so far and the property. Seriously, it's all that Sumerian swindle stuff again. It's not like your house is really yours anyways. If they want to, the government can just build right over it. Next is speculation. Very basically, they use capital to mess with and extract wealth from the markets. Another one is what Big Pharma does, just in general. Now these are just a few to get you started. In reality, there's many ways that they're stealing from us. It's important to expose these things as much as you can to the people around you and to the general public. The Mafia always wants to steal influence from you, just like how they're killing jobs. Another thing, when people say that monopolies or nepotism are the problem, they're being dishonest. Nepotism is normal for any group. The problem is that they intentionally put psychos and monsters in positions of power, and they maintain their monopolies with threats of death, like when it comes to nukes. Now again guys, check out Johnny Gat, and get your family to check him and this out. Marlboro 1, vigilant citizen, but still remember to question everything you hear. Another thing, one of the reasons why they crush economies is so that the adversity can create criminals they can use as pawns. War is good for that as well, with many of their pawns being ex-military. Anyways, your real focus should be on waking people up to the threat. None of this government politics crap matters. Another thing that's important to understand and recognize is babble. In other words, nonsense talk that doesn't really mean anything but just pretends to. You know, like the left-right spectrum thing where the definitions change by the week. In fact, basically all ideologies are full of babble by their very definition. With that said, most of economics is babble too, including GDP as a marker of economic strength. All babble should be dismissed and ignored. Only waking people up to the facts matters. And once again, fact check what I and others say so you can know instead of believe. Also, the Mafia encourages degeneracy to take away the people's ability to call them out. By being a degenerate, you lose your moral high ground and you become apathetic to wrongdoings around you. They'll tell you morals don't exist, but they do. Morals are literally built into your genetics. They make it possible to get along with others and to work together to build a better life. Alright, so priority number 1 at this time is to wake up the Chinese. You know, the Roman Empire and the Chinese never really met. I think it's time that these two groups got close and personal. But at the same time, Germans need to step down and stop fighting the Mafia's wars. But yeah, waking up Chinese people is the most important, and to my Chinese audience, here's something you can do that can have a big impact. All you gotta do is translate some of these so-called alternative media videos that are full of anti-Asian stuff, and then post it on sites like Youku. By the way, there's not much point in trying to wake people up in the Middle East, and as I said, Russia is too dangerous. But in European lands, all this forced diversity is actually an advantage, because all these different people have contact with family in their homelands. And by the way, you can actually make use of all the controlled opposition shells. Just use all the information they give you that's incriminating to the Mafia, but criticize everything that you find suspicious. I mean, it basically makes all their efforts worthless. Only promote the narrative that has tons of evidence behind it while making fun of all these disinfo agents' mistakes. And to my Jewish viewers, you should know that the Mafia views you as meat shields, even those living in Israel. And those Jews holding signs calling out Zionism are shills. Jews have no power as an independent group. So honestly, you should stop calling yourself Jews, cause you're not benefiting from it. You're literally gats, and I have a theory that for you, the 6-pointed star is a brand of sacrifice. I encourage you to look into the history of that, and while you're at it, look into the history of your people. In fact, I'll just say it, unless you're talking about the minority Sephardics and maybe a couple other groups, Jew isn't really an ethnicity. There's no such thing as an atheist Ashkenazi Jew, just predominantly white mongrels who have come to accept the label. A label that the Mafia loves to throw under the bus, if I might add. In fact, currently, the narrative seems to be pushing towards the Jewish question. Just look at how much publicity AIPAC has gotten. Like I said, first they want a war with Muslims. If they can't get that, they'll go for the Chinese. Can't get that, they'll go for the Jews. So yeah, being Jewish does not make you a part of the Mafia. The Mafia is not tied to nationality or ethnicity. They're all mongrels. The reason this small group of people has been able to take over the world is because they're not restrained by anything at all. In other words, they're completely ruthless. They'll kill their own, even family members, like it's nothing. So yeah, all this Jew stuff, it's a meat shield distraction. Now, one thing that should really help flush them out is the banning of religion and nobility. That way, when they get caught gathering to conspire, they no longer have plausible deniability. In fact, the best thing would be for Europeans to end the government in those master state countries. And can we talk about human rights for just a second? They don't exist. There's no intrinsic rights that come with being born a human, and usually the Mafia cites them when they're doing something evil. That's why you should want as much privilege as possible, basically living without the government holding you back. I mean, as long as you're not hurting people, who really cares, and why should they get in your way? Another thing, these white nationalist shield channels have started telling whites to have kids, and at the worst of times. In a few years' time, maybe sooner, whites will very likely face times of crisis that they need to mobilize against. I'm talking about an economic crisis among other things, and raising a child at the same time is just not realistic. It'll be a huge burden, and when things get really bad, you'll have to choose between feeding yourself and your child. It's a good way to lose your humanity. So yeah, now is just not the time for baby making. These shows just want to burden you. Right now, the money you would use to raise a child is better off put to use as a tool for waking others up. Things are never going to get better on their own. This is endgame, you feel me? We're talking about people who have enough wealth for 1,000 lifetimes, but we're still dying a slow death of their construction. It's their instinct to drag others down, no matter how good they have it. They don't even need more wealth or power. They just want to keep taking yours away. And it's really their genetic disorders that make them so dangerous. It causes so many mental health issues. This means that you can never really know what they'll do next, and their minds can change with the wind. And for that matter, the chances of breeding out these kinds of mental illnesses within just a few generations is very slim. Now again, to buy time while the whole world wakes up, we should number 1, focus on waking up the Chinese. Number 2, have whites focus on ending the government in their countries. Just like with Spain, but in Germany, Italy, England, you know, the master states. Also their hammer vassal state known as the USA. That'll slow them down dramatically. Also ban religion and nobility. And again, buffer states would be a good place for this no-gov movement to begin. Now let's talk about a future without them. In the future, the police and the community should have equal power, with a volunteer neighborhood watch, and people should be doing their own investigations. I mean, just look at what they did with the 9/11 investigations. You can only trust what you know, not what you're told. And another thing, there should be a constant, non-stop investigation that looks for attempts by the Mafia to seize power. These guys literally identify with the Phoenix. We must respect that, and even other groups might attempt this. And these investigations should also be run by the public, who should be given resources to do so effectively. Another thing, the prison system should be a public non-profit, and obviously needs a lot of revisions from what we currently have. Government can be replaced by a company or group of companies that offer basic services for a fee and nothing more, with the option to opt out. And the new generation should be educated about how the Mafia operated and how us old-timers suffered under their boot. And we don't need some righteous leader to make this all possible. I don't care if he's the greatest guy in the world, power should be spread out. Like, even if he had perfectly good intentions, what if he gets sloppy with age? What if he gets compromised by the Mafia? There's too many things that can and will go wrong, and finding a person like that in the first place who won't succumb to the power alone is like finding a needle in a haystack. So just forget about it. Let's save ourselves. And by the way, don't talk about what you plan to do unnecessarily. You would make Sun Tzu roll in his grave. Now guys, if you want to see the testing grounds of what they have planned for us, just look at Venezuela. This once fairly nice place to live has had its government's powers bloated by the Mafia. Now people are starving and people are lining up around the block to get rationed on such basic things as toilet paper. You could say it's a real sticky situation. Like I said, yes, robots are taking jobs, but the Mafia doesn't even need to create those jobs in the first place. It's no sweat off their back if people starve. Telling you what's coming to a town near you is also the reason why it took so much time to explain what happened in the Soviet Union. And did I mention it was so bad that people were making the gut-wrenching decision to eat their own children? Look it up. Cause that could be you, cashing in your humanity to live just a few more days. Seriously, dog meat isn't that bad. And by the way, in addition to being completely ruthless, the Mafia is full of people with twisted sexual desires. These are mentally and physically very sick people from centuries and centuries of inbreeding and the Mafia's own form of natural selection. In fact, blue blood really refers to the fact that royals had translucent skin and you could see all their blue veins. But yeah, don't think all these hints and evidence about the Jews being thrown in your face is not intentional. That's just their preparation for Plan C, a war with the Juden. Stuff like this is to make people irrational and too full of hate to see the forest for the trees. And they need an irrational society to give the government legitimacy to rule. So don't give them that. Double down on rationality and knowing instead of believing. That's why I said at the beginning of this video that I don't hate Jews. With all the evidence we're being given in regards to Jews, it would be easy to draw conclusions and turn off our brains. Too easy. And end up in a fight with the Mafia's meat shields, many of which are innocent, wasting all that energy and blood to accelerate everyone's enslavement for the nth time. The last time, actually. Many of the Mafia's court Jews are exposing themselves and laughing about it, but they will never explain the full plot. Remember, the Mafia who has so much but will still kill those who have never wronged them will never allow for a stable society. Your government will always begin slapping down regulations as soon as you start to get comfortable. And they're so obsessed with religion, even though most aren't religious themselves. Religion is just ideology, no different than that Antifa or alt-right babble. And soon I predict they will try to merge all religions into a one-world religion. And to go along with that, they're gonna start pushing religion on kids, so keep an eye out. It could come packaged in any clever form, even degeneracy. But ultimately, this is a race between us and robot technology. Right now, they're pushing hard and pouring money into this field to get sufficiently advanced robots to act as police and military. And when they have them, these ruthless people will no longer care about what society thinks anymore. Robot soldiers feel no guilt and they never get tired. There will be no more need to keep up this current facade that they care about us. And I'm quite sure that robot technology is being advanced by giving these developers offers that they can't refuse. And for everyone else involved in these fields, I ask that you quietly step down. These technologies could certainly be useful, but not concentrated in the hands of the Mafia. I've already described to you at length what these people are like, so think about it. The real issue also is that they get to be so secretive while all of us are fully transparent. Robot technology should be held back and education reformed so that people have the ability and knowledge to easily destroy and create their own robots. That way, power will be spread out once again, as it should be. I think most of us have heard about the Stanford prison study, where they had volunteers act as prison guards and prisoners, and almost right away, the guys playing the prison guards started to abuse their power. And it just got worse and worse, and these are just normal people. It's going to be living hell being trapped in the cartoonish North Korean type world that the Mafia has planned for us. With their twisted minds, we'll be forced to do homosexual acts for them on a regular basis. And they're gonna do pedo stuff to your children and get off on the fact that you can't do anything about it. And your wife? Maybe if they're not too busy, but mostly you're gonna wish no one in your family was born with buttholes. But yeah, as I said, secrecy is a big power they have over us, but spreading the word can help get more eyes on them. Constant surveillance of them is easy these days with cell phone technology, but making a big scene right now when not enough people are woke is just dumb. You will be singled out, demonized, and attacked. That's the reason why the vast majority of these shield channels are so Eurocentric. It's to contain this awakening within white societies and direct people's attention towards the juice. That's just them distracting people to buy time, so don't buy into it. Everyone needs to know, and even these Jews exposing themselves intentionally is useful as long as you follow this principle. This goes for my Arab viewers as well. If you're tired of seeing your brothers being slaughtered in the Middle East, it's better to travel the world spreading the truth than just telling your own community. These guys steal technology from foreigners anyway, so when foreigners know, it cripples their agenda. You know, the funny thing is though, even after everyone else is dead, these people will still continue to cannibalize each other, even their own family, until none remain. Humanity will literally end because of a bunch of sociopathic, mentally diseased super perverts. Now, as things stand, there's still a lot of whites that still have wealth, and it's better to put your resources into traveling the world while spreading the word. Because if we fail, there is no future. Even though the world is a land of plenty, we'll get none. Now remember, chimping out and having a revolution has never worked. It's better to treat the Mafia like an onion and meticulously peel the layers. And for my Jewish viewers who get triggered by me saying that they throw Jews under the bus, well, they're in the process of doing it again. Soon no one will get anything for going along with their plans, only death. Now one thing you guys can do to help spread the truth locally is to start dropping letters in mailboxes. You might also try sending mass letters without a return address, but I'm not too sure about the logistics of that. But be aware that when modern printers print something they drop hidden codes that would help authorities track down the source. So be clever about it. But anyways, since all this is really Jews from 4chan think I'm some kind of Chinkakadian, I'm gonna be pretending to be Chinese. And I will be teaching philosophy to help wash away everyone's degenerate ways. But yeah, mailboxes are big. You see how many houses kids can do on Halloween? Now again, I encourage you guys to fact check me, especially if you need any convincing about what I say. And the full list of YouTube channels I want you to check out but continue to question are Johnny Gat, Barrelbale1, Sean Jones, Vigilant Citizen, Really Graceful. And I think that's it. Remember, the Chinese must know, cause that's exactly what they don't want. The white pope not daring to officially visit China points towards that. Alright guys, that's it. I think I'm gonna start selling gas masks soon, cause this YouTube revenue stuff is never gonna work out. Oh, and try refreshing the page after you watch the whole video. See if the view count goes up.